Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest chapters, a time when the falling leaves of autumn didn't just signal the changing seasons, but mark the beginning of terror, a time when a simple butterfly could condemn you to death. When 60,000 people were executed for a crime that never existed, tonight we uncover the truth behind the witches of autumn. So before we step into this story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we create here. I pour my heart into researching these stories, and your support means the world. Oh, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Are you cozy in bed in California? Maybe it's raining where you are in Oregon. I genuinely want to know. Now dim those lights, let the soft glow of your screen be your only companion, and if you have a fan or some gentle background noise, even better. Let's dive in. Picture this. It's October. You can feel it, can't you? That shift in the air. The way the sunlight hits differently, golden, but somehow thinner. Shadows stretch longer. The wind carries a chill that makes you pull your sweater a little tighter. Leaves crunch beneath your feet in shades of amber and crimson, and suddenly pumpkins appear on every doorstep. Skeletons dance in front yards, and witches, always witches, black hats, broomsticks, cauldrons bubbling with mysterious potions. But here's what's interesting and a little unsettling. This association between witches and autumn, it's not just a Halloween marketing gimmick, it's rooted in something much older, much darker, and entirely real. See, we think of witch imagery as fun, right? Cute even. Your neighbor hangs a decorative witch on their porch, kids dress up for trick-or-treating. We watch Hocus Pocus and laugh. But strip away the commercialization, peel back the layers of time, and you'll find something that should make us pause. The connection between witches and autumn was written in blood. Let me take you back. Not to some vague, dusty medieval past, but to specific moments. Real dates, real people. Between the years 1400 and 1782, that's nearly 4 centuries. Somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe and colonial America. Not tried, not accused, executed. That number, by the way, comes from historical consensus from scholars who've spent lifetimes combing through trial records and execution logs. And here's the part that matters for our story tonight. A disproportionate number of these accusations and trials occurred during autumn, specifically in the lead up to winter. Why? Well, let's think about what autumn meant for people in the 1500s and 1600s. For us, it's pumpkin spice lattes and cozy sweaters. For them, autumn was Judgment Day. Imagine you're a farmer in a small German village in 1626. You've worked the land all spring and summer. Your survival, your family's survival, depends entirely on the harvest. If the crops come in strong, you eat through winter. If they fail, you starve. It's that simple, that brutal. Now imagine you've done everything right. You've planted, carefully tended your fields, prayed to God for good weather. But then in September, just as you're about to harvest, the temperature drops. Frost comes early. Or maybe it's hail, sudden, violent, destructive. In a single night, your entire crop is destroyed. Your children will go hungry. Your livestock might not survive winter without enough feed. People in your village will die. So you ask yourself, why did this happen? Why did God allow this? And here's where it gets dark. Because in that era, they didn't have meteorology. They didn't understand weather patterns or climate systems. What they did have was theology and folk belief and fear. They believed that weather could be controlled, manipulated, by those who had made pacts with the devil. They believed in witches. Now I want to pause here because this is important. When we hear autumn festivals today, we think of wholesome community events, right? Harvest festivals, Thanksgiving. But the roots of these celebrations go much deeper back to ancient pagan traditions. The festival of Samian, celebrated by the Celts around November 1st, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter. It was believed to be a time when the boundary between the living and the dead became thin, when spirits could cross over, when magic was at its most potent. Similarly, Mabon, the autumn equinox, around September 22nd was a time of balance, equal day and night, light and dark in perfect equilibrium. But after that moment, darkness begins to win. Days grow shorter, nights grow longer, the world descends into cold. For pre-Christian societies, this wasn't frightening, it was just nature's cycle. They celebrated it with bonfires and feasting. But when Christianity spread across Europe, these old pagan celebrations didn't just disappear, they went underground. They got reinterpreted And by the time we get to the 1500s, that reinterpretation had become sinister. Church authorities began teaching that these autumn gatherings, these old harvest celebrations, weren't innocent festivals. They were witches' sabbaths, secret meetings where devil worshippers gathered under the harvest moon to plot the destruction of Christian society. Can you imagine your grandmother's harvest celebration passed down through generations suddenly being labelled as devil worship? But here's what really amplified the fear: economic anxiety. Let me give you a specific example. In German folklore, and remember, Germany became the absolute epicenter of witch trials. There was a belief in something called Molkensteller. The word literally translates to way stealers. And what were these way stealers? Butterflies. Yes, butterflies. You see, in German folk belief, witches could shapeshift into butterflies to sneak into barns and spoil milk, steal cream, ruin butter. Dairy products were precious. Sometimes the difference between malnutrition and survival. So if your milk spoiled, if your butter wouldn't churn properly, it wasn't bad luck or bacteria. It was a witch transformed into a butterfly, hexing your livelihood. Sounds absurd, right? Almost charming in its specificity. But people died because of this belief. Women were burned alive because a butterfly happened to flutten past someone's milk pail at the wrong moment. The fear was real. The stakes were existential. Now Martin Luther himself, yes, that Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation guy, wrote about what he called Drachenbräute, dragon brides. These were women believed to be in contact with household spirits that looked like dragons. These spirits in folklore were supposed to bring prosperity to families, but by the 1500s they'd been reinterpreted as demons, as proof of devil worship. Luther wrote warnings about these women, and in the climate of fear that gripped Germany during the Reformation, those warnings became death sentences. Here's what I find both fascinating and heartbreaking. The same season that was once celebrated as a time of abundance, of being thankful for nature's gifts, became a season of terror. The same harvest moon that once lit joyful celebrations became the moon under which neighbours accused neighbours. Because here's the thing about witch hunts: they don't happen in a vacuum. They happen during times of crisis, of uncertainty, of fear. And autumn in the pre-industrial world was the season of ultimate uncertainty. Will we have enough food? Will we survive winter? If the harvest fails, who's to blame? The answer too often was the witch among us. There's a chilling logic to it, isn't there? If you believe that witches can control weather, and people absolutely believe this, then when disaster strikes during the harvest season, the witch hunt begins. Because someone must be responsible. Someone must be punished. Someone must be stopped before they destroy what little remains. I want you to understand these weren't stupid people. They weren't uniquely cruel or ignorant. They were human beings facing genuine existential threats, operating within a worldview that included supernatural explanations for natural events. To them, hunting witches wasn't barbarism, it was self-defense. It was protecting their families. That's what makes it so disturbing, because it means we can't simply dismiss them as backwards medievals. We have to recognize that under the right conditions, fear, scarcity, crisis human beings are capable of rationalizing almost anything. An autumn with its falling leaves and darkening skies, its bountiful harvests or devastating failures, its ancient associations with death and spirits and the thinning veil between worlds. Autumn became the perfect backdrop for hysteria. The witches of autumn weren't real, but the fear of them that was as real as the frost that killed the crops. So the next time you see Halloween decorations, the pointy-hatted witch on a broomstick, the black cat, the full moon, remember, these images are echoes, distorted commercialized echoes of a time when people genuinely believed their neighbors could fly, could curse, could bring ruin with a whispered spell. And they killed them for it, by the tens of thousands, many of them during autumn. The season of harvest became the season of horror. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. This is Europe we're talking about, right? Medieval times. Surely this kind of mass hysteria couldn't happen in the modern era. And yet, it did. Right here in America, in 1692, in a small Massachusetts colony called Salem, where autumn brought not just the harvest but a body count. But Salem, as infamous as it became, was just one chapter. A relatively small outbreak compared to what happened in Europe, because there was one country, one region specifically, where the witch trials reached a scale and brutality that's almost incomprehensible. A place where entire towns were nearly wiped out, where mayors, councilmen, even children were burned at the stake, where the legal system didn't just permit torture, it required it. That place was Germany. And what happened there makes Salem look like a preview of coming attractions. The story of the German witch trials, and specifically what happened in the autumn of 1626 in two small towns, Bamberg and Würzburg, is a descent into organized state-sanctioned horror that challenges everything we think we understand about human nature. But that's where we're heading next, into the heart of darkness, into the witch-burning capital of the world, where autumn didn't just bring falling leaves, it brought falling bodies, hundreds of them. And the question we have to ask ourselves is how did this happen? What turned ordinary communities into execution grounds? The answer is more disturbing than you might imagine, because it wasn't just fear or superstition, it was systematic, it was legal, and in many ways it was profitable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take this journey step by step, layer by layer, until we understand not just what happened, but why the witches and autumn are forever tragically intertwined. Stay with me. The story only gets darker from here, but it's a darkness we need to understand because its shadows still fall across us today. Germany. Even the name carries weight, doesn't it? A country of deep forests, medieval castles, fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm. But there's another story woven into that landscape, one that the fairy tales don't tell. Between 1561 and 1670, something happened in the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire that defies comprehension. Out of every 10 people executed for witchcraft in all of Europe, 4 of them died in Germany. Let me put that in perspective. We're talking about roughly 25,000 people, burned alive, in just over a century, in a region that at the time was barely larger than modern-day Texas. That's not a witch hunt, that's industrial-scale execution. So tonight we need to ask the uncomfortable question, why Germany? What made this particular place at this particular time become the absolute epicenter of witch-hunting terror? The answer isn't simple, but it starts with something you might not expect: geography and politics. Picture the Holy Roman Empire in the 1600s. Now, despite its grand name, it wasn't really holy, wasn't particularly Roman, it definitely wasn't a unified empire. Voltaire famously joked about this centuries later, but the joke had deadly consequences. The empire was a patchwork, a crazy quilt of hundreds, and I mean hundreds of tiny independent territories, prince-bishoprics, free cities, duchies, counties, ecclesiastical states. Each one had its own ruler, its own laws, its own courts. And here's the critical part: each one could decide whether to hunt witches, and how aggressively to do it. There was no centralized authority to say stop, no appeals court to review sentences, no king to pardon the accused. If a local prince-bishop decided that his territory had a witch problem, he could launch a full-scale persecution and nobody could tell him no. Compare that to, say, Spain. The Spanish Inquisition. Yes, that Spanish Inquisition, the one with the terrifying reputation, executed maybe 24 people for witchcraft. Total. You know why? Because Spain had a strong central authority. The Inquisition itself, ironically, was skeptical of witchcraft claims. They required actual evidence, physical proof, not torture-induced confessions. Or take England. The English executed maybe 500 people for witchcraft over 2 centuries. Still horrific, but a fraction of Germany's toll. Why the jury system? Common law, built-in checks and balances that made it harder to railroad innocent people to the gallows. But Germany was the Wild West of witch trials. And 2 territories, 2 small towns really became the absolute worst of the worst. Let me tell you about Würzburg and Bamberg. It's 1626, autumn. The 30 Years' War is raging across Europe, Catholics versus Protestants, tearing the continent apart. People are dying by the thousands in battles. But in these 2 quiet towns in what's now Bavaria, a different kind of killing is about to begin. In Würzburg, a man named Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg has just become Prince Bishop. In Bamberg, it's Johann Georg II, Fuchs von Dornheim. Both men are devout Catholics. Both are determined to stamp out Protestantism. Both genuinely believe that witches are destroying their territories, and both men have unlimited power. Here's what happened next. And I want you to really sit with this because the scale is almost incomprehensible. In Würzburg, between 1626 and 1631, just 5 years, approximately 900 people were executed for witchcraft. In Bamberg, during roughly the same period, over 1,000 people died. Now you might be thinking, okay, but these must have been big cities, right? No. Würzburg's population was maybe 10,000. Bamberg was even smaller, We're talking about towns where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for generations, where the baker knew the blacksmith who knew the mayor, and they started burning each other. Let me give you some math that'll chill you. In Bamberg, out of a population of around 2,200 people, 500 were executed in just 3 years. That's nearly 1 in 4 people. Gone. Can you even imagine you wake up one morning and a quarter of everyone you know is dead? Your neighbour, your cousin, the woman who sells you eggs at the market, the man who fixes your wagon. All accused, all tortured, all burned. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. This wasn't random. It was systematic. The prince-bishops created what historians now call witch commissions. Official government bodies dedicated entirely to finding and executing witches. They hired full-time witch hunters. They built special prisons. In Bamberg, they constructed something called the Druden House, the witch house, a dedicated torture facility. Think about that for a moment. They built a building specifically for torturing people into confessing to impossible crimes. The process went like this. Someone would be accused, maybe a neighbour had a grudge, maybe their crops failed, and they needed someone to blame, maybe they were just odd, different. Once accused, you were arrested. No trial first, no opportunity to defend yourself. Just arrested. Then came the interrogation, and here's where German law at the time becomes crucial. In 1530, the Holy Roman Empire had adopted something called the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina. It was supposed to be a unified legal code, progress right, except it had a provision. Torture was not only permitted to extract confessions in witchcraft cases, it was mandatory. If you were accused of witchcraft, you would be tortured. That wasn't a possibility, it was procedure, and the torture didn't stop until you confessed. And this is the truly diabolical part, your confession alone wasn't enough. You had to name accomplices, other witches, at least 5 other names typically. Do you see the trap you're being tortured? The pain is unimaginable. The only way to make it stop is to confess. But then you have to give them names, so you name people. Maybe people you don't like, maybe people you barely know. Maybe you just make up names, hoping they won't find those people. But they do find them, and then those people are tortured, and they name more names, and the cycle spirals out of control. It's like a chain letter from hell. There's a letter that survived from this period, written in August 1629 by a chancellor in Würzburg to a friend. Let me share part of it with you, because it captures the absolute madness. As to the affair of the witches, which your grace thinks brought to an end, before this it has started up afresh, and no words can do justice to it. Ah, the woe and the misery of it! There are still 400 in the city high and low, of every rank and sex, nay, even clerics, so strongly accused that they may be arrested at any hour. 400 people waiting to be arrested, in a town of maybe 10,000. He goes on. It is true that of the people of my gracious prince here, some out of all offices and faculties must be executed, clerics, electoral councillors and doctors, city officials, court assessors, several of whom your grace knows. Did you catch that? Clerics, doctors, city officials. This wasn't just targeting poor, marginalised women. By 1629, the witch hunt had grown so out of control that it was consuming the elite, the educated, the powerful. Nobody was safe. And you want to know something darkly ironic. Some historians believe this is actually what ended the trials. Once wealthy, connected men started getting accused, men who had the resources to appeal to higher authorities, to complain to the emperor himself. Suddenly, people in power started questioning whether maybe, just maybe, this whole thing had gone too far. In 1630, after a complaint reached the imperial chamber court in Speyer, the emperor issued a public condemnation of the Würzburg persecutions. In 1631, both prince-bishops died Dornheim, in Bamberg-Ehrenberg in Würzburg. That same year, Swedish armies occupied the region. The trial stopped, almost overnight. But the damage was done. The trauma was generational. And historians estimate that in those 5 years, in just those 2 territories, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people had been executed. Now I know what some of you might be asking. Why autumn, specifically? Why did so many of these German trials happen in fall? Remember what we talked about earlier, the harvest. But in Germany there's another layer, the Little Ice Age. Between roughly 1560 and 1630, exactly the peak of the witch trials, Europe experienced some of the coldest weather in recorded history. Summers were short, winters were brutal. Frost came early and stayed late. Harvests failed, people starved. In Würzburg and Bamberg in the years leading up to 1626, there had been a series of crop failures, unusually cold autumns, early frosts that destroyed vineyards and remember wine was a major part of the economy in these regions. When the grapes froze on the vine, people didn't just lose money, they lost their livelihoods. So in 1626, when the weather turned cold again, when the harvest looked uncertain, people needed an explanation. And they needed someone to blame. The prince-bishops provided both. Witches were causing the cold. Witches were ruining the harvest. Witches were in league with Satan to destroy good Christian society. And the solution burned them all. There's a horrible historical irony here. The very conditions created by climate change, the Little Ice Age, made people more likely to believe in witchcraft. And that belief led them to kill the very people who might have helped them survive, the healers, the herbalists, the women who knew how to preserve food and treat illness with limited resources. They literally killed their way into making things worse. I want to share one more story with you before we move on, because it's important that we remember these weren't just statistics. They were people, individuals with names and families and stories. In Bamberg, there was a man named Johannes Junius. He was the mayor, respected, educated, wealthy. Exactly the kind of person you'd think would be safe from accusation. In 1628, he was arrested, accused of witchcraft, and he was tortured. At first, he denied everything, but the torture continued. They used thumbscrews, the strappado where you're hung by your wrists, which are tied behind your back, dislocating your shoulders, sleep deprivation, on and on. Finally, he confessed. He said he'd made a pact with the devil. He named other witches, including his own daughter. But before he was executed, he managed to smuggle out a letter to that daughter. It's one of the most heartbreaking documents to survive from the witch trials. In it, he writes, "Many 100,000 good nights, dearly beloved daughter Veronica. Innocent have I come into prison, innocent have I been tortured, innocent must I die. They never leave off with the torture till one confesses something. Innocent though he be, he must be tortured till he confesses something." He describes the torture in detail, how he finally broke, how he made up everything they wanted to hear just to make the pain stop, and he ends the letter begging her to keep it secret because if the authorities found out he'd written it, they'd torture him again before the execution. Johannes Junius was burned at the stake on August 6, 1628. His letter survived, and it stands as testimony to the absolute horror of what happened in Germany during those autumn months of persecution. Now you might be wondering, did people at the time think this was normal? Did everyone just go along with it? No, there were voices of dissent. A Jesuit priest named Friedrich Spee, who served as a confessor to accused witches in the Würzburg trials, was so horrified by what he witnessed that he wrote a book in 1631 called Cautio Criminalis, a warning about these criminal trials. He argued that the use of torture made the trials fundamentally unjust, that innocent people were being killed. His book was published anonymously because he knew speaking out could get him accused of witchcraft too. Think about that. A priest, a man of God, had to publish anonymously because telling the truth was too dangerous. But his words and the words of other skeptics eventually began to change minds. Slowly. Too slowly for the thousands who'd already died. But change did come. The question is, why did it take so long? And why did Germany specifically become the epicenter of this horror? We've touched on the political fragmentation, the lack of centralized authority, the legal system that mandated torture, the religious conflicts of the Reformation, the climate crisis of the Little Ice Age. But there's another piece of the puzzle we haven't fully explored yet. A book. One single book that spread across Europe like a virus, teaching people exactly how to identify, interrogate, and execute witches. A book so influential that it shaped the imagination of witch hunters for 2 centuries. A book that some historians argue killed more people than any other book except perhaps Mein Kampf. It was called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, and understanding this book, where it came from, what it taught, and why people believed it, is essential to understanding how the witch trials became so widespread and so deadly, because ideas have consequences. And this particular idea, this idea that women were inherently susceptible to demonic influence, that witchcraft was a vast conspiracy, that torture was justified to root it out, this idea lit fires that burned for centuries, fires that consumed Germany first and worst, but fires that spread far beyond those borders. So let's talk about the book that started it all. The blueprint for mass murder. the text that turned superstition into system and fear into law. Let's talk about the Hammer of Witches, 1486. That's the year everything changed. A single book was published in the German city of Speyer. It wasn't particularly long, maybe 500 pages. It wasn't written by anyone famous. And yet this book would go on to become one of the deadliest texts in human history. Its title, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. And for the next 2 centuries it would be used to hammer innocent people into confessions, into graves, into ash. Here's what's extraordinary and terrifying about this book. It was reprinted at least 30 times between 1487 and 1669. Think about that. This is before mass marketing, before the internet, before even reliable mail service. And yet this book spread across Europe like wildfire, translated into multiple languages, read by judges and clergy and intellectuals from Scotland to Poland. It became quite literally a bestseller, the self-help book of witch hunting, except instead of helping anyone, it taught them how to kill. So we need to understand this book. Who wrote it? What did it say? And why? Why did so many intelligent, educated people believe it? The author was a man named Heinrich Kramer. In Latin, he went by Henricus Institoris. He was a Dominican friar, a member of the Inquisition operating primarily in southern Germany and Austria. And by all accounts, let's just say he was a piece of work. Kramer was obsessed with witches, specifically with female witches, and even more specifically with the idea that women were inherently prone to demonic corruption. In the 1480s, he'd been trying to launch witch trials in various German territories, but he kept running into a problem local authorities thought he was kind of extreme, too zealous. Several bishops actually blocked his efforts and told him to calm down. So what did Kramer do? He wrote a book, a comprehensive manual that would validate his obsession and convince skeptics that witchcraft wasn't just real, it was an existential threat to Christian civilization. But here's the clever part. He knew that a book written by one controversial inquisitor wouldn't carry much weight. So in 1484 he travelled to Rome and convinced Pope Innocent VIII to issue a papal bull, an official church document condemning witchcraft and authorising Kramer to investigate it. The bull was called Summis Desiderantes Effectibus, desiring with supreme ardour. And Kramer printed it right at the beginning of his book, giving the Malleus the appearance of papal approval. It was brilliant marketing. Devious, but brilliant. The book opened with what looked like the Pope's endorsement, even though the Pope probably never read the actual text, and that gave it an authority it might not otherwise have had. Now you might be wondering, what exactly was in this book that made it so influential? The Malleus Maleficarum is divided into 3 parts. Let me walk you through them because understanding the structure helps us understand why it worked. Part 1 is basically theology. It argues in scholastic language with references to the Bible and church fathers that witchcraft is absolutely real, that denying the existence of witches is itself heresy, that anyone who says witches aren't real is actually helping the devil. Can you see the trap there? If you're skeptical of witch hunts, you're not just wrong, you're a heretic. You might be a witch yourself. It's a perfect silencing mechanism. But part 1 does something else that's crucial. It explicitly links witchcraft to women. There's a section, and I'm going to quote this directly because you need to hear it, where Kramer writes, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable." He goes on to explain in excruciating detail why women are more susceptible to the devil's temptations than men. Women are weaker in faith, more gullible, more emotional, more lustful. He even breaks down the word femina, the Latin word for woman, claiming it comes from fee faith and minus, less. Therefore women have less faith. This is of course complete nonsense. Bad etymology, worse theology. But it's presented with such confidence, with so many citations and logical arguments, that it seems scholarly, authoritative, and it gave witch hunters theological permission to target women specifically. 80% of witch trial victims were women not by accident but by design. The blueprint said so. Part 2 of the Malleus is where things get really dark. This section is essentially a field guide to identifying witches. How can you tell if someone's a witch? Well, according to Kramer, there are signs. Lots of them. Does she live alone? Suspicious. Does she have a cat? Definitely suspicious. Does she know about herbs and healing witch? Does she get angry when insulted? Witch. Is she unusually beautiful? That's the devil's lure. Is she unusually ugly? That's the devil's mark. Do you see the problem? By Kramer's standards, almost any woman could be identified as a witch if someone wanted to accuse her. But the Malleus doesn't just list signs, it describes in disturbing detail what witches supposedly do. They can fly through the air, they attend Sabbaths where they worship the devil, they kill babies and use their fat to make flying ointment. They can cause impotence in men. This was apparently a major concern for Kramer. They can make men's genitals disappear entirely. Yes, really. There's a whole section about witches stealing penises and keeping them in nests where they wiggle around like living creatures. I wish I was making this up. But this is actually in the book, and people believed it. The Malleus also introduced something that would become central to witch trials, the concept of the demonic pact. The idea that witches didn't just use magic, they had signed a contract with Satan, usually in blood. In exchange for their souls, they received supernatural powers. This transformed witchcraft from a folk practice into heresy, into devil worship, into an organized conspiracy against Christianity. And once you frame it that way, once you convince people that there's a vast satanic cult working to destroy society from within, well, suddenly any measure seems justified to root it out. Which brings us to part 3, the part that actually killed people. Part 3 is a legal manual, a step-by-step guide for judges on how to conduct witch trials. And this is where the Malleus becomes less a theological text and more an instruction manual for torture. Kramer lays out the entire process, how to interrogate suspects, what questions to ask, how to interpret their answers, and most crucially when, and how to use torture. According to the Malleus, torture is not only permitted in witchcraft cases, it's necessary. Because witches have supernatural protection from the devil, they won't confess unless forced. Therefore, torture is actually a kindness. It breaks the devil's hold and allows the witch to confess and potentially save her soul. The book provides specific techniques. It advises shaving the accused completely hair on the head, body, everywhere, because witches supposedly hide magical charms in their hair. It recommends searching for the devil's mark, an insensitive spot on the body where the devil supposedly marked his follower. Finding such a spot required jabbing the accused with needles until you found an area where they didn't react, which, after enough stabbing, you'll eventually find. And the Malleus makes one thing crystal clear: the accused will be tortured until they confess. Not if, when. Confession is inevitable, because torture will continue until it happens. But here's the truly diabolical twist. The confession alone isn't enough. The accused must name accomplices, other witches, at least 5 names typically, and if they refuse, more torture, because if they're really repentant, they'll want to help root out the evil. Can you imagine being in that position? You've been tortured into confessing to something you didn't do. Now you have to give names, real names of real people, people who will then be arrested and tortured exactly as you were. What do? Do you condemn innocent people to save yourself further pain? Do you make up names and hope they don't exist? Do you name people you hate, people who wronged you, turning your torture into revenge? The Malleus created a machine, a self-perpetuating machine of accusation and torture and death. And it came with the apparent blessing of the church and the authority of scholarly argument. Now, I mentioned earlier that this book was reprinted 30 times. Let me give you some context for why that's significant. This was just decades after Gutenberg's printing press. Books were still relatively new technology. Printing was expensive. Publishers only reprinted books that sold. That had demand. The Malleus Maleficarum was in demand. Judges wanted it. Inquisitors wanted it. Local authorities wanted it, because it gave them answers. It gave them structure. It gave them permission. Before the Malleus, witch beliefs were local, fragmented, inconsistent. Different regions had different ideas about what witches could do. But after the Malleus, there was a script, a standardized narrative of what witchcraft was and how to fight it. Suddenly, across Europe, accused witches were confessing to remarkably similar things: flying to Sabbaths, making pacts with the devil, causing storms and crop failures. The confessions were consistent because the torture manual was consistent. Some historians have called the Malleus Maleficarum the first viral media phenomenon. And in a dark way, they're right. It spread rapidly, it shaped behavior across vast distances, and it created a shared, if horrifying, reality. But here's a question worth asking: did people at the time buy into this completely, or were there doubters? The answer is complicated. The Roman Inquisition, the official Catholic Inquisition based in Rome, was actually pretty skeptical of witch accusations. They thought witchcraft claims were often superstition, and that most confessions were unreliable. Spain and Italy, which had strong inquisitorial oversight, had relatively few witch trials. Some Protestant reformers were initially skeptical too. But then Martin Luther decided witches were real and dangerous, and that complicated things in Protestant territories. There were individual skeptics, writers and scholars who questioned whether an old woman could really fly on a broomstick or make a man's penis disappear. But publishing such skepticism was dangerous. It could get you accused of denying the devil's power, of heresy, of being a witch yourself. So the skeptics mostly stayed quiet, and the Malleus remained influential. Even as late as the 1600s, more than a century after publication, judges in Germany were citing the Malleus as legal authority. It had become canon, unquestionable. And here's what's particularly chilling. The Malleus wasn't written by a stupid man. Kramer wasn't ignorant or uneducated. He was learned. He knew Latin theology law. He structured his arguments, carefully cited sources, followed logical forms, which means the Malleus is a reminder that intelligence doesn't protect you from dangerous ideas, that education doesn't guarantee wisdom, that you can construct elaborate, internally consistent arguments for absolutely monstrous positions. The Malleus Maleficarum proves that evil doesn't always arrive with obvious villainy. Sometimes it arrives wearing robes of authority, carrying books of learning, speaking in the language of law and reason. And that's perhaps its most important lesson for us. Now the Malleus laid the groundwork. It provided the theology, the identification guide, the legal procedure. But for all its influence in Europe, there was one place where it arrived late. One place where the witch trials played out differently, without torture, without burning, but with a hysteria that would become perhaps the most famous witch panic in history. I'm talking about colonial Massachusetts, about Salem, and here's what's fascinating. The Salem trials happened in 1692, more than 2 centuries after the Malleus was published. By that point, witch trials were actually declining in Europe. The Enlightenment was dawning. Skepticism was growing. But in this small Puritan colony thousands of miles from Europe, the witch panic was just beginning. Why? What sparked it? And how did a community of devout Christians, many of them educated, many of them having fled religious persecution themselves, how did they end up hanging their neighbors? The answer involves young girls, invisible specters, and a community already fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. It involves accusations that spread like disease through a village where everyone knew everyone's business and everyone's secrets. And it involves a legal principle, spectral evidence that would make the Salem trials unique in the history of witch hunts. A principle so absurd, so divorced from reason, that even at the time people questioned it. But questioning it loudly enough to stop the trials that took longer, and in the meantime 19 people died. So let's cross the Atlantic. Let's step into a cold New England winter in 1692, into a village gripped by fear where the line between the natural and supernatural had dissolved, and where pointing a finger could become a death sentence. Let's talk about Salem. January 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts. If you've ever experienced a New England winter, you know what this means. Bitter cold, grey skies that seem to press down on you. Snow that doesn't melt, just accumulates, turning the world into something between white and dirty grey. Houses are drafty. Food is monotonous, salted meat, dried beans, maybe some preserved vegetables if you're lucky. And the nights are endless. In one of these houses, something started that would end with 19 dead and a town's name forever synonymous with injustice. 2 girls, Betty Paris, 9 years old, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 11. They lived in the household of Reverend Samuel Paris, the village minister. And in that cold, dark January, they began to exhibit strange behaviors, contorting their bodies into impossible positions, screaming, making animalistic sounds, complaining of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces, hiding under furniture, interrupting prayer with gibberish. Now, if this happened today, we might think psychological episode, maybe trauma, possibly a neurological condition. But in 1692, in a Puritan community that saw the devil's hand in every misfortune, there was only one explanation: witchcraft. And once that word was spoken, there was no taking it back. Here's what you need to understand about Salem Village in 1692. This wasn't some peaceful, harmonious Puritan paradise. It was a community already fracturing under multiple stresses. First, there was geography. Salem Village was technically part of Salem Town, the coastal, prosperous, merchant-oriented Salem that still exists today. But the village was inland agricultural poorer, and the villagers resented being under the town's authority. They wanted independence. They wanted their own church, their own governance. This created factions. Some families allied with Salem town, others pushed for village independence. And these weren't polite disagreements. These were deep, bitter resentments that had festered for decades. Then there was the matter of the minister. Salem village had trouble keeping pastors. They'd gone through several, each leaving after disputes with parishioners. Samuel Parris, who arrived in 1689, was controversial from the start. He demanded ownership of the parsonage. He insisted on his firewood allowance. He preached fiery sermons about enemies within the congregation. Half the village supported him, half opposed him. And this split ran through families, through the church, through every aspect of village life. But there was something else. Something that made Salem village particularly volatile in 1692. War. From 1688 to 1697, there was a conflict called King William's War, the colonial theatre of a larger European war between England and France. And the frontier of this war, it ran right through northern New England and what's now Canada. Native American tribes allied with the French conducted raids on English settlements. Entire villages were destroyed. People were killed or taken captive. And the survivors. They fled south, becoming refugees. Many of them ended up in Salem village. Now imagine you're a Salem villager. Your community is already divided and contentious. Resources are tight. And suddenly you have refugees arriving, traumatized people, with stories of violence, of homes burned, of family members killed. People competing for limited resources, limited space, limited work. The stress level was astronomical. And into this pressure cooker dropped the accusation of witchcraft. The first 3 people accused were perhaps predictably outsiders or vulnerable people. Tituba was an enslaved woman in the Parris household, likely of indigenous Caribbean origin. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who went door to door asking for charity and who cursed people when they refused her. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who'd stopped attending church and who'd married her indentured servant, scandalizing the community. None of them had power. None of them had protection. They were perfect first targets. On February 29th, 1692, a leap day which some thought was supernatural in itself, the 3 women were examined, not tried, examined, in a public proceeding at the meeting house with most of the village watching. And this is where Salem becomes unique in the history of witch trials, because Salem didn't use torture, at least not physical torture. Massachusetts law, influenced by English common law, didn't permit the judicial torture that was routine in European witch trials. So how did Salem get its confessions? Through something arguably more insidious spectral evidence. Here's how spectral evidence worked. The accusers Betty Abigail and soon several other young women claimed they could see invisible spectres, ghost-like forms of the accused witches that tormented them. During the examinations, the girls would shriek and contort, claiming the accused spectre was pinching them, choking them, attacking them. And here's the crucial part: only the girls could see these spectres. No one else could. So the court had to take their word for it. Think about that for a moment. You're accused of witchcraft. You're standing in a courtroom. Young girls are screaming that your invisible spirit is attacking them. You can't prove you're not sending out a spectre, because how do you prove a negative? How do you prove that something invisible isn't happening? It's the perfect, unfalsifiable accusation. Now, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne maintained their innocence, but Tituba confessed, and her confession was elaborate, vivid, detailed. She described making a pact with the devil, who appeared to her as a tall man in black from Boston. She said there were other witches. She'd seen 9 names in the devil's book. She described a winged creature, cats, a yellow bird. She said the witches met secretly and planned to hurt the children. Why did Tituba confess? Historians debate this. Some think Parris, her enslaver, coerced her. She may have been beaten, though there's no record of it. Others think she was simply terrified and trying to survive. In witch trials, those who confessed and repented often received lighter sentences than those who maintained innocence. But whatever her motivation, Tituba's confession changed everything. Because if she was a witch and there were other witches, then the hunt was on. Within weeks, more accusations flew. Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, joined the accusers. So did several other girls and young women ranging from 11 to 20 years old. And the pattern that emerged is fascinating and disturbing. Look at who got accused. Martha Corey, a church member in good standing, but one who'd expressed skepticism about the witch claims. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman beloved and respected, but whose family was on the opposite side of the Parris dispute. John Proctor, a tavern keeper who'd spoken out against the accusations. Do you see the pattern? The accusations mapped onto existing conflicts. The Putnams, one of the most prominent accusing families, had land disputes with several of the accused. There were old grudges, old insults, old competitions coming to the surface under cover of witchcraft accusations. This wasn't random. This was a community weaponizing witchcraft accusations to settle scores, and the legal system enabled it. In May 1692, a new governor, William Phips, arrived in Massachusetts. He found the jails overflowing with accused witches, over 70 people imprisoned awaiting trial. So he established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Termina, to hear and to determine. The judges were local men, some well-intentioned probably, but none were trained lawyers, and they made a fatal decision they would accept spectral evidence. The first trial was Bridget Bishop on June 2nd, 1692. She was convicted largely on spectral evidence the girls claimed her spectre tormented them. On June 10th, she was hanged on what's now known as Gallows Hill, and the executions didn't stop. 5 people hanged in July, 5 in August, 8 in September. Here's something that often gets overlooked. The Salem trials were fast, terrifyingly fast. From accusation to execution could be just weeks. There was no lengthy appeals process, no higher court to review the verdict. Once you were convicted, you were hanged. And the demographic of victims tells a story. Of the 19 executed, 14 were women, but 5 were men, and 3 of those men were husbands or relatives of accused women. John Proctor defended his wife. Giles Corey refused to enter a plea, perhaps trying to protect his property from confiscation. Giles Corey's death was particularly horrifying. In English law, if you refused to enter a plea, you couldn't be tried. To force a plea, they used pressing, placing heavy stones on your chest until you either entered a plea or died. Giles Corey, 80 years old, was pressed to death over 2 days. His last words reportedly were, "More weight." But here's what's truly mind-bending about Salem. Even at the time, even as the trials were happening, people had doubts. Increase Mather, one of the most prominent ministers in Massachusetts, and president of Harvard College, published a book in October 1692 called Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. In it he wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." And crucially, he argued that spectral evidence was unreliable. The devil could assume the shape of innocent people. Seeing a spectre didn't prove the person was a witch. This was radical, and it worked. The new Governor Phips, whose own wife had been accused, began to doubt the trials. In October 1692, he dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termina. A new court was established in January 1693, but this one didn't accept spectral evidence. And suddenly, almost everyone was acquitted. Of 50 people tried, only 3 were convicted, and those convictions were immediately overturned by Governor Phips. By May 1693, all remaining prisoners were released. The Salem witch trials, which had consumed the community for over a year, were over. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 more dead in jail from the horrific conditions, probably 200 people accused, countless families destroyed, and then silence. Here's what gets me about Salem, the speed with which it started, and the speed with which it ended. In Europe, witch trials could go on for years, decades even. But Salem burned bright and fast like a fever that spiked and then broke. Why? Partly because the execution started claiming respectable people. When Martha Corey, a church member, was hanged, it shook people. When Rebecca Nurse, beloved by many, was executed, despite petitions on her behalf, doubts grew. And partly because the circle of accusations kept widening. Eventually, accusers named people who were too prominent, too well connected. The wife of Governor Phips was accused. So was Lady Mary Phipps's friend Margaret Thatcher, not that Margaret Thatcher, a prominent Boston woman of the same name. When the accusations reached the elite, suddenly people in power took notice. Suddenly spectral evidence seemed less reliable. Funny how that works, isn't it? But there's another aspect of Salem that's often overlooked. The aftermath, the reckoning. Because unlike many European witch trials, where the horror was simply buried and forgotten, Salem actually had a public acknowledgement of error. In 1697, 5 years after the trials, Massachusetts held an official day of fasting and repentance. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood up in church and publicly confessed his guilt, asking for forgiveness. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers, now 27 years old, made a public confession. She said she'd been deluded by Satan, that she'd helped condemn innocent people, and she begged forgiveness. Over the following decades, the Massachusetts government passed acts reversing the convictions and providing restitution to victims' families. But here's the sobering part. It took until 1957 for Massachusetts to formally apologize for the trials, and the last person to be legally exonerated, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. That happened in 2022, 330 years after her conviction. Let that sink in. Someone convicted in 1692 wasn't officially cleared until 2022. Justice delayed is justice denied, as they say. But at least Salem eventually faced its history. So what do we take from Salem? What lessons does this small outbreak of witch panic, small by European standards, but enormous in its impact on American consciousness? What does it teach us? First, that torture isn't necessary for false confessions. Salem proved you can get people to confess to accuse others without laying a hand on them. Social pressure, fear, the desire to survive the reward of attention, these can be just as coercive as thumbscrews. Second, that witch hunts are never really about witches. They're about stress conflict and scapegoating. Salem was about land disputes and factional politics dressed up in supernatural language. Third, that institutions matter. The decision to accept spectral evidence enabled the trials. The decision to reject it ended them. Legal standards can be the difference between justice and massacre. And fourth, and this is perhaps most important, that it can happen anywhere. Salem weren't medieval peasants. They were literate, educated, religious people. Many had fled persecution themselves, and yet they persecuted, which means none of us are immune. None of our communities are safe from mass hysteria if the conditions are right. But we haven't answered a crucial question yet. We've talked about the trials themselves in Germany and Salem across Europe. We've talked about the book that spread the witch hunting doctrine, but we haven't really looked at who these accused witches actually were. Not as abstractions, not as statistics, but as people. Because when we say 80% of witch trial victims were women, that's not just a number. That's mothers, daughters, healers, widows, neighbours. When we say elderly woman executed for witchcraft, that's someone's grandmother, someone who'd lived through decades of hardship, who'd survived plagues and famines and childbirth, who'd accumulated wisdom and perhaps property, and perhaps just enough independence to make her dangerous. So who were these women? Why them specifically? And what does the pattern of accusations tell us about the societies that condemned them? The answer reveals something we're still grappling with. Something about how communities respond to women who don't fit neat categories. Women who own things, know things, or simply refuse to be invisible. Let's look closer at the real witches. The actual human beings behind the accusations, because their stories, their lives, and their deaths, that's where the truth really lives. Let me tell you about a woman named Alce Young. You've probably never heard of her. History barely remembers her. We don't know how old she was. We don't know what she looked like. We don't even know exactly what she was accused of doing. But we know this. On May 26, 1647, in Hartford, Connecticut, Alce Young became the first person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. She was hanged. And then, history moved on. Her story, her life, her voice gone. Reduced to a single line in a colonial record book, Alce Young was hanged. Now multiply that erasure by 60,000, because that's roughly how many people were executed for witchcraft in Europe and colonial America. And for most of them, all we have is a name. Sometimes not even that. Just a notation, one woman burned. But here's what we do know. When historians started actually analysing the trial records, court documents, church registries, when they started looking at who these people really were, a pattern emerged. A damning, devastating pattern. 80% of witch trial victims were women. In some regions, it was even higher, 90% to 95%. Now you might be thinking, well, you already told us that. The Malleus Maleficarum targeted women. True. But I want you to understand what that actually meant. Not as theology or theory, but in lived reality. Because these weren't just any women. There was a profile, characteristics that made you vulnerable. And when you see the pattern clearly, you realise witch trials were a form of social control, a way of policing femininity, punishing independence, and let's be blunt, stealing from women. Let me show you what I mean. The typical witch trial victim, if we can use the word typical for something so horrible, was a woman over 40 years old, often over 50, frequently a widow. Why does that matter? In early modern Europe, when a woman's husband died, she inherited his property. Suddenly she owned land money, maybe a business. She had economic independence. She didn't need to remarry. She didn't need male protection. and that made her dangerous. Let me give you a specific example. In Essex County, England, one of the most intensively studied witch trial regions, researchers found that accused women were significantly more likely to own property than the average woman they'd inherited from husbands or fathers. And in a society where women weren't supposed to have independent wealth, where property was supposed to pass from father to son, man to man, a widow with assets was an anomaly, an aberration. And anomalies in times of fear get eliminated. Here's the really dark part. When a witch was convicted, her property was confiscated, forfeited to the state or to the church or sometimes to the accusers themselves. The trials weren't just ideological, they were profitable. Some historians have called witch trials a form of legal plunder, and they're not wrong. But it wasn't just about property, it was about knowledge. Think about who held medical knowledge in early modern communities, before there were doctors, or rather before male university-trained physicians became common. Who did people go to when they were sick, when they were injured, when women were pregnant? Midwives, herbalists, cunning folk, mostly women. These were the people who knew which plants could ease pain, bring down a fever, help with childbirth. They knew the old remedies passed down through generations. They had practical medical knowledge gained from experience, and they were seen as competition by the emerging class of male medical professionals. Now, I want to be careful here. Some older feminist histories argued that witch trials were specifically designed to eliminate midwives and female healers. That's probably overstated. Most accused women weren't professional healers. But here's what is true. Women with healing knowledge were overrepresented among the accused. Why? Because healing knowledge, especially knowledge about herbs and potions, looked like magic. Because unsuccessful treatments could be blamed on malice rather than limited medical understanding. Because women who possessed special knowledge, who knew things, were viewed with suspicion. Let me tell you about Ursula Kemp, tried and executed in Essex, England in 1582. She was what they called a cunning woman, someone locals went to for healing and advice. When she successfully treated someone's child for illness, people were grateful, but when someone she treated later died, suddenly those same grateful people remembered her as a witch. Her knowledge, which had been valued, became evidence against her. Do you see how that works? The same skills that made you useful made you vulnerable. Then there were the women who were simply inconvenient. The argumentative ones. The ones with sharp tongues. The ones who didn't defer to male authority. The ones who in the language of the time were scolds. In England and Scotland, they had a legal punishment specifically for women who talked too much or too critically. The scold's bridle, also called the branks. It was a metal cage that fit over your head, with a plate that went into your mouth sometimes, with spikes preventing you from speaking. That was the punishment for women who used their voices wrong. For witchcraft, which often included accusations of cursing, of speaking ill wishes, the punishment was death. Let me share a specific case that illustrates this perfectly. Margaret Scott, executed in Salem in 1692, was described by neighbours as quarrelsome. She'd had disputes over property boundaries. She'd spoken harshly to people who she felt had wronged her. She was by the standards of the time a difficult woman. She was also 77 years old, and they hanged her for it. Because a difficult old woman with no male protection, a woman who didn't know her place, a woman who dared to argue with her neighbours, she could be reframed as a witch. Her arguments became curses. Her anger became evidence of malice. Her refusal to be meek became proof of alliance with Satan. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked, the younger women accused of witchcraft. Because it wasn't only elderly widows, young women could be accused too, but usually for different reasons. Often it was about sexuality. Beautiful young women might be accused because their attractiveness was seen as supernatural, a devil's lure. Homely young women might be accused because their lack of beauty was seen as a deformity, a mark of Satan. You really couldn't win. But there's a particular type of young woman who's especially vulnerable, the unmarried mother. Having a child outside of marriage was scandalous in early modern Europe. Shameful. And if that child died, which sadly was common given infant mortality rates, suspicion could fall on the mother. Had she killed it? Was it a sacrifice to the devil? Was the father the devil himself? There's a heartbreaking case from Scotland in 1591. A young woman named Gillis Duncan was accused of witchcraft partly because she had unusual musical talent. She could play instruments beautifully, which was seen as supernatural. But the accusations escalated when it was discovered she'd been sexually active. Under torture, she confessed to witchcraft and was burned alive. She was probably in her early 20s, her crime being talented and sexual. That was enough. Here's something that might surprise you. Men could be accused too. We said 80% of victims were women, which means 20% were men. But when you look at who these men were, the pattern continues to be revealing. Often they were relatives of accused women, husbands who defended their wives, sons who stood up for their mothers. They were collateral damage in attacks on women, or they were men who didn't fit masculine norms, men who were too gentle, men who were healers or herbalists' feminine occupations, men who were in some way too womanly, or they were outsiders, foreigners, people of different ethnicities or religions. In other words, people who didn't fit in. There's a fascinating case from Iceland where actually the majority of accused witches were men. Historians still debate why Iceland was different, but even there the accusations often centered on magic that violated gender norms like love magic, which was considered a feminine form of witchcraft. The pattern holds witch trials punished people who didn't conform, and women, by virtue of being women in patriarchal societies, were always potential nonconformists. Let me tell you one more story. This one is from Germany, from a trial record that survived with unusual detail. Her name was Katharina Kepler. Yes, Kepler, she was the mother of Johannes Kepler, the famous astronomer, the man who figured out that planets move in elliptical orbits, one of the founders of modern astronomy. In 1615, when Katharina was in her late 60s, she was accused of witchcraft by a neighbour in Württemberg. The accusations were petty. Someone got sick after drinking a potion Katharina had prepared. There was a dispute about property. Old grudges surfaced. But because of who her son was, because Johannes Kepler was famous and connected, he was able to mount a serious legal defence. He hired lawyers. He wrote briefs. He used his connections to the Duke of Württemberg. The trial dragged on for 6 years. Katharina was imprisoned. She was shown the instruments of torture, the terrification as it was called, where you're taken to the torture chamber and shown what will be done to you unless you confess. She was 73 years old. She never confessed. And in 1621, thanks to her son's efforts and resources, she was acquitted. But the ordeal broke her. She died 6 months later. Now here's what's important about this story. Katharina Kepler survived because her son was Johannes Kepler. Because he had money, connections, education, and the ability to work the legal system. How many women didn't have that? How many mothers and daughters and wives had sons who were farmers, not famous astronomers, had families with no resources, no connections, no ability to fight back? All of them. Almost all of them. Katharina Kepler's survival was the exception that proves the rule. If you were an ordinary woman accused by your neighbours with no powerful family to defend you, you were almost certainly doomed. So what do all these women have in common? The widows, the healers, the quarrelsome ones, the beautiful and ugly, the young mothers, and old grandmothers. They were all vulnerable. They either had something people wanted, property knowledge, sexual appeal, or they lacked something. People valued male protection, youth, conventional beauty, submissive behaviour. They were, in the language of sociology, liminal, in between, outside clear categories, and societies under stress don't like ambiguity. They need clear boundaries, clear roles, clear rules. Women who blurred those boundaries became targets. But here's what really keeps me up at night. In most cases, the accusations came from neighbours, from people who knew these women. This wasn't strangers pointing fingers. This was communities turning on their own. The woman who borrowed eggs from you last week could accuse you this week. The woman whose child you helped birth could testify that you'd cursed the baby. The woman you'd known your entire life could watch you hang. What does that do to a community? What does it do to trust, to social bonds, to the basic fabric of human connection? And what does it teach women about how to behave? If being too knowledgeable, too independent, too argumentative, too visible could get you killed, what's the lesson? The lesson is make yourself small. Make yourself quiet. Make yourself dependent. Don't stand out. Don't accumulate too much. Don't know too much. Don't speak too much. Disappear a little, for your own safety. And that brings us to perhaps the darkest question of all, the one we've been circling but haven't directly confronted. How do you get a confession? How do you make someone admit to flying on a broomstick, to dancing with the devil, to cursing their neighbours with supernatural powers? We've touched on torture in Germany. We've mentioned the psychological pressure in Salem, but we haven't really looked at the mechanics of it, the specific techniques, the systematic process of breaking a human being down until they'll say anything, absolutely anything, to make it stop. because understanding how confessions were extracted is essential to understanding how the witch trials functioned. It's the engine that drove the whole machine. Without confessions, without names of other witches, the trials would have sputtered and died. But with torture, and make no mistake, there were dozens of specialized techniques refined over centuries. The trials became self-sustaining, a perpetual motion machine of accusation and confession and death. And the people who designed these techniques, who refined them, who wrote manuals about them, they weren't sadists in dungeons. They were legal scholars, clergy, educated men who believed they were doing righteous work. That's what we need to confront next. Not just what torture was, but how it was justified. How intelligent people convinced themselves that inflicting unimaginable pain on elderly women was not only acceptable, but necessary. Holy even. Because once you understand that, once you see how normal people rationalize extraordinary cruelty, you start to recognize the patterns in your own world, your own time. And that's when the history stops being comfortable, when it stops being about those people back then and starts being about what humans are capable of, what we're all capable of under the right circumstances. So take a breath, because what comes next is hard. It's specific and brutal, and it's going to be difficult to hear. But it's necessary, because the victims of witch trials didn't have the luxury of looking away. The least we can do is bear witness to what they endured. Let's talk about torture, the methods, the justifications, and the terrible logic that made it all seem reasonable. There's a Latin phrase that was central to European law for centuries, confessio est regina probationum. The confession is the queen of proofs. It meant that a confession was the highest, most reliable form of evidence, better than witnesses, better than physical proof. If someone confessed, that was it. Case closed, truth established. And in witch trials, confession wasn't just preferred, it was required. Because how else do you prove supernatural crimes? How do you present physical evidence of flying on a broomstick or making a pact with an invisible devil? You can't. So you need the accused to admit it. Which brings us to a question that's as old as legal systems themselves. What do you do when someone won't confess to something you're absolutely certain they did? The answer in early modern Europe was simple and horrifying. You hurt them until they do. Now, I want to be very careful here. This section deals with historical torture methods. It's not going to be gratuitous. I'm not going to dwell on pain for the sake of shock value. But we do need to understand what happened. Because without understanding the mechanics of how confessions were extracted, we can't understand how the witch trials functioned. So if you need to step away for a few minutes, I understand. Take care of yourself. But if you're staying, know that what follows is historically documented, legally sanctioned, and absolutely real. Let's start with the legal framework, because that's important. In most of Europe by the 1500s, the judicial system operated under what's called inquisitorial procedure. This is different from the accusatorial system used in England and later America, where you have a prosecutor and defense attorney arguing before a jury. In the inquisitorial system, a judge conducts the investigation. He's prosecutor, investigator, and decision-maker all at once. And the goal isn't to argue two sides, it's to discover the truth. Now that might sound reasonable, except for one problem. How does the judge know what the truth is? How does he know the accused is guilty, or often he just knew, based on reputation rumours, the fact that someone accused them? And if he knew they were guilty and they wouldn't confess, then clearly they were being stubborn, obstructive, protected by the devil. So torture became a tool to overcome that obstruction, to break through the devil's protection and force the truth out. And here's the really insidious part. It was regulated, legalized. There were rules about when you could use torture, how much on whom. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, that German legal code from 1530 we mentioned earlier, laid it all out. You needed some preliminary evidence before torturing witnesses, suspicious circumstances, something. You couldn't just grab random people off the street. But for witchcraft, the bar was incredibly low. An accusation from one or two witnesses was often enough. A bad reputation, the fact that someone got sick after arguing with you. Once that threshold was met, torture was not just permitted, it was mandatory. So what did torture actually look like? Let me describe one of the most common methods, the strappado. Your hands are tied behind your back. A rope attached to your wrists is thrown over a beam in the ceiling. Then you're hoisted up so you're hanging by your wrists, which are behind you. Now think about your anatomy for a second. Your shoulders aren't designed to bear your full body weight in that position. Within minutes, excruciating pain, The shoulders start to dislocate, the elbows strain, your entire upper body is on fire, and that's just the basic version. Sometimes they'd add weights to your feet, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. Now you're not just hanging, you're being pulled apart. Sometimes they'd hoist you up, then drop you, suddenly stopping just before you hit the ground. The jerk on your already dislocated shoulders is, well, I'll let you imagine. One woman in Bamberg, Germany endured the strappado 6 times over the course of her interrogation. 6 times. And she still didn't confess, at least not until they moved on to other methods. Her name was Anna Hansen. She was 42 years old. Eventually she confessed to everything they wanted, and then she was burned alive. Here's another common technique, the thumbscrew. It's exactly what it sounds like. A mechanical device like a small vice that slowly crushes your thumbs, or fingers, or toes. Sounds medieval, right? Primitive. Except these devices were precision-made by skilled craftsmen. They had screws and gears. Some had different settings for different levels of pressure. They were tools manufactured and sold specifically for judicial torture. There were markets for this stuff. Torture instrument makers. It was an industry. And the beautiful, horrible thing about thumbscrews is that they leave relatively little visible damage. Crushing bones is internal, so you could be tortured extensively and still be presented in court looking relatively normal. No one in the audience would see the shattered bones in your hands. Let me tell you about a specific case. In Scotland in 1590 there was a woman named Agnes Sampson. She was a midwife and healer well respected in her community. She was accused of witchcraft as part of the North Berwick witch trials, a major panic that even involved King James VI of Scotland, who later became King James III of England. Agnes was tortured repeatedly. Thumbscrews. Sleep deprivation kept awake for days on end, and something called the witch's bridle, an iron framework that enclosed her head, with a bit that went into her mouth sometimes with spikes on it, preventing her from speaking or sleeping. After extensive torture, she confessed to attending a witches' sabbath, where over 200 witches supposedly plotted to kill the king by raising storms at sea. She gave specific elaborate details about the meeting, about the devil's appearance, about the spells they cast. And then she was strangled and burned. Years later, when people looked back at the North Berwick trials, even contemporaries admitted that the confessions seemed suspicious, too elaborate, too detailed, too convenient. But by then, Agnes Sampson and dozens of others were dead. Now let's talk about something called the swimming test, or ordeal by water. This one's based on an interesting piece of logic. Water is used in Christian baptism, right? It's wholly pure. Therefore, water would reject a witch, someone who'd renounced baptism and Christianity. So they'd tie up the accused thumbs to toes or hands, bound legs bound, and throw them into a river or pond. If you sank, congratulations, you're innocent. Of course you might drown while you're establishing your innocence, but hey, at least you die with a clean soul. If you floated even a little, even for a moment guilty, you're a witch. The water rejected you. Now we'll execute you officially. Can you see the trap? It's literally impossible to win. Now here's the thing. People usually float at least initially, especially if there's air in their clothing or lungs. Bodies have buoyancy. This isn't supernatural, it's physics. But in the logic of the witch trials, physics was proof of magic. There's a particularly disturbing account from England in 1612 during the Lancaster witch trials. An elderly woman named Janet Preston was subjected to the swimming test. She floated briefly before sinking. The crowd watching took the brief floating as proof positive of guilt. She was hanged shortly after. The swimming test was particularly popular in England and colonial America. It had the advantage from the accuser's perspective of being a neutral test. God would decide. Except, of course, the test was designed so that survival meant guilt and death meant innocence. It's like flipping a coin where both sides say guilty. But here's what might be the most psychologically devastating form of torture, sleep deprivation. This doesn't sound as dramatic as being stretched on a rack or hung by your thumbs, but sleep deprivation is incredibly effective at breaking people. The accused would be kept awake for days, sometimes by guards who would shake them whenever they dozed, sometimes by being walked around continuously, sometimes by being kept standing or in uncomfortable positions that made sleep impossible. After about 3 days without sleep, you start to hallucinate. Your cognitive function deteriorates, your resistance crumbles, you'll say anything, agree to anything just for the chance to sleep. And here's the really clever part, sleep deprivation doesn't leave marks. There's no physical evidence. You look fine, maybe tired, but fine. So when you confess, it seems voluntary. It seems like your conscience finally broke through, not that you were tortured into submission. There's a trial record from Würzburg that describes a woman kept awake for 6 days straight. By day 4, she was confessing to things that were physically impossible, attending a Sabbath on a night when multiple witnesses had seen her in her home. But the court didn't care about the contradiction. They had their confession. She named 12 other witches under this duress. All 12 were arrested. Several were eventually executed. 1 confession, 12 more arrests. That's how the system perpetuated itself. Now I want to address something that often comes up. People ask, why did they confess to such impossible things? Flying on broomsticks, sex with demons. Couldn't they just confess to minor witchcraft and be done with it? And the answer is, the interrogators had a script. Remember the Malleus Maleficarum? It provided specific questions to ask, a template for what witches did. And the interrogators used leading questions, suggestions, repeated accusations, until the confessor learned what answers were expected. Did you fly to the Sabbath? No. More torture. Did you fly to the Sabbath? No. More torture. Did you fly to the Sabbath? Yes. But it doesn't end there. How did you fly on a broomstick on an animal? Did the devil carry you? And so on. The interrogator essentially wrote the confession through their questions. The victim just had to agree. And here's the truly heartbreaking part. Sometimes people internalize these confessions. After enough torture, enough repetition, enough psychological manipulation, some victims actually started to believe they had done these things. False memories formed under extreme duress. There's documented psychological research on this phenomenon even in modern times. When humans are subjected to enough stress, enough suggestion, enough authority telling them what they did, the brain can actually create false memories. Confabulation psychologists call it. Imagine being tortured, exhausted, terrified, in agony, and someone in authority, someone educated, powerful, representing the law and the church tells you with absolute certainty that you're a witch, that you flew to the Sabbath, that you made a pact with the devil. After a while, a small confused part of your brain starts to wonder, did I? Maybe I did and I've forgotten. Maybe I'm possessed and don't remember. The human mind under extreme stress does strange things to survive. Let me share one more account because it illustrates the complete system. In Bamberg in 1628, there was a man we mentioned before, Johannes Junius, the mayor. Here's what happened to him in his own words from that letter he smuggled to his daughter. First, the strappado. 8 times they hoisted me up and let me fall again so that I suffered terrible agony. Then thumbscrews. They put the thumbscrews on me so that the blood ran out at the nails and everywhere. Then leg screws. They put the leg screws on me so that the blood spurted from the calves. And through all this, the interrogators kept asking the same questions. Did you see the devil? What did he look like? Who else was at the Sabbath? What did you do there? Johannes held out longer than most. But eventually he broke. He confessed to meeting the devil who appeared as a goat, to attending Sabbaths with other named witches, to renouncing God. All of it fabricated, all of it torture-induced. And in his letter he wrote, "Innocent have I come into prison, innocent have I been tortured, innocent must I die. For whoever comes into the witch prison must become a witch, or be tortured until he invents something out of his head." That's the system in a nutshell. Torture until you invent something. And what you invent must include other names. The machine must be fed. Now here's a question, did everyone approve of this? Were there no voices saying, wait, maybe torturing elderly women until they claim they had sex with goats isn't the best path to truth? There were, but they were few, and they were dangerous voices to raise. We mentioned Friedrich Spee before, the Jesuit priest who wrote Cutio Criminalis, condemning the use of torture in witch trials. But there were others. In the Netherlands, a physician named Johann Vier published books in the 1560s arguing that most accused witches were simply mentally ill, not demon-possessed, that their confessions under torture were unreliable. He was denounced as a heretic. His books were banned in many regions. In England, a man named Reginald Scott wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584, systematically debunking witch beliefs and condemning torture. King James III was so offended by the book that he ordered it burned. The problem was this: if you question witch trials too loudly, you risked being accused yourself of being a witch sympathizer, or a witch. So most people stayed silent. even when they had doubts, even when they watched neighbours being tortured for impossible crimes. The cost of speaking up was too high, and so the torture continued, for decades, for centuries, until finally, slowly, the voices of skepticism grew loud enough, numerous enough, protected enough by Enlightenment thinking and legal reforms that the system began to crack. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. What we need to understand is this torture wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. It was how the system worked. Without torture, you don't get confessions to supernatural crimes. Without confessions, you don't get executions. Without executions, the witch trials collapse. And maybe that's the most disturbing realization of all. This wasn't senseless violence, it wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic, logical within its own framework, legally sanctioned and procedurally regulated. Evil but organized evil, evil with paperwork. And that's perhaps more frightening than chaotic brutality, because it means ordinary people, judges, clerks, craftsmen making torture devices, citizens watching the trials all participated in a system of horror while believing they were doing righteous work. They weren't monsters, they were humans who'd convinced themselves that cruelty was justice. Now the confessions extracted through torture had specific content, specific claims about what witches did, and these claims were remarkably consistent across Europe. Witches flying to Sabbaths, dancing with devils, performing specific rituals. This consistency was used as evidence that witchcraft was real. Look, the authorities said, witches in Germany confess to the same things as witches in Scotland. Surely this proves the Sabbath exists. But of course what it really proved was that the torture manuals were the same, that the Malleus Maleficarum had spread its template across Europe, that interrogators were asking the same leading questions everywhere. So let's examine these confessions. Let's look at what witches supposedly did when they flew to their Sabbaths, because understanding the mythology, the shared story that emerged from thousands of torture sessions, helps us understand what these trials were really about. It wasn't about actual magical meetings in forests. It was about fears and anxieties projected onto vulnerable people, about communities externalizing their darkness onto scapegoats. The Sabbath myth tells us more about the societies that created it than about any actual witches. So let's step into that mythology. Let's explore what people believed happened when witches gathered under the autumn moon, and let's see what those beliefs reveal about the communities that held them. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this scene. It's midnight. A clearing deep in the forest far from any village. A bonfire blazes in the centre, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. And around that fire, hundreds of figures, mostly women, dancing in a circle, moving counterclockwise, always counterclockwise, the devil's direction. At the centre of the circle sits a figure on a throne, sometimes described as a man dressed in black, sometimes as a goat standing upright, sometimes as a dragon or a toad of enormous size. This is the devil himself presiding over his followers. The witches approach one by one to kiss him, and here the accounts get explicit and disturbing, to kiss him beneath his tail in what's called the obscene kiss. Then comes the feast. Tables laden with food, though the food tastes wrong, flavourless, sometimes rotten. Wine that's actually blood. And in some accounts the bodies of murdered infants prepared as a cannibalistic meal. After the feast the devil distributes powders and potions, teaches new curses and spells, receives reports on what harm each witch has caused since the last meeting, assigns new tasks, whose crops to destroy, whose children to kill, what storms to summon. And then comes the dancing again, wilder now, frenzied, until finally the devil pairs each witch with a demon and they couple in the darkness, sealing their pacts with sexual union. Just before dawn, the witches mount their broomsticks or goats or flying demons and soar back to their homes, arriving just in time to slip into bed before their families wake. This is the witches' Sabbath, the diabolical gathering, and thousands of people across Europe confess to attending exactly this kind of meeting. Different countries had their own local variations. In Germany they flew to the Blocksberg, also called the Brocken, the highest peak in the Harz Mountains. In France it might be a crossroads or an ancient standing stone. In Scotland the North Berwick Church. In Spain the fields of Zugarramurdi. But the basic elements remained remarkably consistent. The flight through the air, the devil presiding, the perversion of Christian rituals, the obscene acts, the conspiracy to harm Christianity. So here's the question that should be obvious by now. Did any of this actually happen? And the answer is no, of course not. But here's the more interesting question. Why was the myth so consistent? Why did torture victims from Scotland to Poland confess to such similar experiences? Because understanding where this mythology came from, how it developed and spread, tells us everything about what the witch trials were really about. Let's start with the term Sabbath itself. It's a Jewish word referring to the Jewish day of rest and worship. The fact that Christians use this term for supposed witch gatherings is significant. It reveals an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in witch trial ideology. Throughout medieval Europe, there were conspiracy theories about Jews that they murdered Christian children in rituals, that they desecrated communion wafers, that they met secretly to plot against Christianity. These were called blood libels, and they led to horrific pogroms and violence against Jewish communities. The Witches' Sabbath inherited this mythology. It took existing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and applied them to a new enemy, women accused of witchcraft. The idea of a vast, organised secret society plotting to destroy Christianity from within, that's the core fear, and it's been applied to different groups throughout history: Jews, Muslims, heretics, witches, and as we'll see later, it continues today in different forms. But where did the specific details come from? The flying, the obscene kiss, the backwards dancing. Here's where it gets fascinating, because these elements have roots in much older pre-Christian traditions that were reinterpreted through a Christian lens. Before Christianity spread across Europe, many communities had seasonal celebrations, fertility rites in spring, harvest festivals in autumn, winter solstice celebrations. These often involved dancing bonfires, feasting, sometimes sexual elements. Fertility was important for agricultural societies, and rituals often involved symbolically ensuring fertility. When Christianity became dominant, the Church tried to eliminate these pagan practices. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they Christianized the festivals, turning them into saints' days, and sometimes the old practices just went underground, continuing in modified forms. Now, by the 1400s, 1,000 years after Christianity's dominance, these old pagan festivals had largely disappeared. But the memory of them lingered. Folk tales about ancient rites, stories grandmothers told about the old ways, and church authorities looking to explain witchcraft seized on these half-remembered traditions as evidence. Those old harvest dances, clearly they were actually devil worship. Those fertility rites, obviously orgies with demons. They took fragments of pre-Christian culture and reconstructed them as proof of an ongoing satanic conspiracy. Let me give you a specific example. In parts of Scandinavia and Germany, there were traditions of women called night riders, or storm riders in folklore. These were supposed to be spirits, or magical women who rode through the sky during winter storms, bringing fertility to fields. In the original folklore, they weren't necessarily evil. They were powerful, maybe dangerous, if you disrespected them, but also potentially beneficial. A remnant of old goddess worship, probably. But by the 1500s, these folk traditions had been reinterpreted. The night riders became witches flying to Sabbaths. Their sky riding became evidence of demonic flight. Their connection to storms became proof they caused destructive weather. A folk memory became a conspiracy theory. Then there's the broomstick. Why broomsticks? This detail is so iconic, witches riding broomsticks, that we forget to ask where it came from. One theory involves actual hallucinogenic practices. In medieval Europe, some healers and folk practitioners made ointments from plants with psychoactive properties. Henbane, belladonna, mandrake. These plants contain compounds that can cause hallucinations, sensations of flying out-of-body experiences, and here's the interesting part: these ointments were sometimes applied to, let's say, intimate areas, using a stick or broom handle. The mucous membranes there absorb compounds quickly into the bloodstream. So there may have been actual women, herbalists, healers, who used hallucinogenic ointments and experienced the sensation of flying. And they may have described these experiences to others using the language of their culture. I flew to the mountain. I met with the spirits. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean witches actually existed. It means some practices that could be misinterpreted as witchcraft existed. The leap from some women use psychoactive herbs to there's a vast satanic conspiracy is a huge one, driven by fear and ideology, not evidence. But it's possible that fragments of actual practice herbalism, folk healing, psychoactive experiences became woven into the mythology of the Sabbath. The authorities took whatever scraps of reality they could find and built a fantasy around them. Now let's talk about the devil himself as he was described in these confessions. The devil at the Sabbath is almost always male, powerful and sexual. He's a figure of authority, sitting on a throne, receiving worship, distributing rewards and punishments. Sound familiar? He's basically an inverted version of a king or lord or priest. The Sabbath is a parody of court ceremonies and church services. Witches kneel before the devil, just as peasants knelt before nobles. They kiss his posterior just as courtiers might kiss a king's hand. It's a loyalty oath, but degraded, humiliating, obscene. They feast at his table just as nobles feast at their lord's table, but the food is rotten, tasteless, a commentary on how devil's gifts are ultimately hollow. They receive communion, but instead of bread and wine blessed by a priest, they receive demonic powders and potions. Do you see what's happening? The Sabbath myth is taking the hierarchical structure of medieval society and inverting it, making it demonic, dark, evil, and this tells us something important. The Sabbath wasn't just about fear of magic. It was about fear of social disorder, fear of an alternative hierarchy where women and outcasts had power, where the normal rules didn't apply. The Sabbath represented everything the social order wasn't supposed to be: women in leadership roles, sexual freedom, mockery of religious authority, peasants mingling with nobles as equals because at the Sabbath, as the confessions describe, everyone dances together regardless of station. It was the ultimate inversion. The world turned upside down. And that inversion is what made it so terrifying to authorities. Because if such a place existed, if such gatherings were real, then the entire social order was under threat. Let me share a specific confession that illustrates this beautifully. In 1662, in Scotland, a woman named Isabel Gowdy gave one of the most detailed and elaborate Sabbath confessions ever recorded. And here's the strange thing: she wasn't tortured. She confessed voluntarily in enormous detail across multiple sessions. She described meeting the devil who appeared as a man in black. She named 13 members of her coven. She described flying through the air after saying a charm, horse and hattock in the devil's name. She claimed they shot elf arrows at people to cause illness. She said they turned into animals. She specifically described becoming a hare. Her confessions went on for weeks, and they're so detailed, so internally consistent, so vivid, that historians have debated for centuries what was going on here. Some think she was mentally ill, experiencing delusions. Some think she'd learned about witch lore from previous trials, and was essentially confabulating, creating a fantasy based on cultural narratives. Some think she was actually part of some folk practice, not devil worship, but some surviving pagan tradition that she described in the only language available to her. We'll never know for sure. But what's clear is this Isabel Gowdy's confession became a template. It was cited in later trials, it spread, and it reinforced the Sabbath myth. Whether she was describing real experiences, delusions, or fiction, it didn't matter. Her words became evidence that the Sabbath was real. And here's the tragic irony: we don't know what happened to Isabel Gowdy. There's no record of her execution. Some historians think she may have been quietly released, which would be unusual. Others think the records were simply lost. She gave the authorities everything they wanted, the most detailed Sabbath confession in Scottish history, and then she disappeared from the historical record. A voice speaking elaborately about fantastical events, and then silence. Now here's something crucial to understand: the consistency of Sabbath confessions was used as proof that Sabbaths were real. How could people in different countries who've never met describe the same experiences? The authorities argued. This proves the Sabbath exists, but we now know why the confessions were consistent, because the interrogators were reading from the same script. The Malleus Maleficarum described what witches did. Later demonology books elaborated and refined the mythology. Judges read these books. They asked leading questions based on these books, and victims under torture or threat of torture gave the answers the interrogators wanted. It's like if I asked 100 people under duress, "You robbed a bank by tunnelling underground, didn't you?" The tunnel was exactly 50 feet long, wasn't it? And you wore a red mask, didn't you? Eventually, many of them would confess to these specific details, and then I could point to the consistency of the confessions as proof that this particular bank robbing method was common. But the consistency wouldn't prove the crime happened. It would just prove I asked the same questions. That's what happened with Sabbath confessions. The consistency proved that interrogators across Europe were reading the same manuals and asking the same questions, nothing more. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Some historians argue that the Sabbath myth reveals deep psychological and social anxieties. Think about the sexual elements. The confessions obsess over sex witches copulating with demons, performing perverse sexual acts, the devil having cold genitals, impotence curses. This is a society deeply anxious about sexuality, especially female sexuality. Women's sexual desire was seen as dangerous, insatiable, corrupting. The witches' Sabbath gave expression to these fears. Or think about the cannibalism element eating murdered babies. This taps into fears about motherhood, about women as nurturers being inverted into women as destroyers, or the weather magic destroying crops with storms. This is about economic anxiety, food security, the fundamental fear of starvation. The Sabbath myth was a fever dream of a society under stress. It took every anxiety, economic, sexual, social, religious, and projected them onto an imaginary gathering of devil worshippers. And then, having created this myth, they tortured real people into confessing to it, and executed them for crimes that never happened. It's almost, and I say this carefully, it's almost as if the Sabbath did exist, but not as a real gathering. It existed in the collective imagination, a shared nightmare that entire communities believed in, and they fed real people into that nightmare. Now you might be wondering, did anyone at the time point out how absurd these confessions were? Yes, some did. In 1563, a man named Johann Weyer, that same physician we mentioned earlier, published a book where he systematically dismantled Sabbath claims. How can elderly women fly through the air? How can hundreds of people gather without anyone noticing them leave their homes? How can the devil be in multiple places simultaneously? How do these massive gatherings leave no physical evidence, no trampled grass, no remains of fires? He argued quite reasonably that the Sabbath was impossible, that the confessions were products of torture, delusion, or mental illness. But his book was banned in many Catholic countries. Protestant leaders like King James I condemned it, because accepting Weyer's arguments meant accepting that the entire witch-hunting enterprise was built on fantasy, and too many people had too much invested in the fantasy being real. Property had been confiscated, people had been executed, careers had been built on prosecuting witches. Admitting the Sabbath was imaginary meant admitting that thousands of people had been murdered for nothing. So the myth continued. For decades more, for centuries in some places. Here's what gets me though. The Sabbath myth didn't die with the witch trials. It transformed, it mutated, it found new hosts. In the 1980s and 90s, the United States and parts of Europe experienced something called the Satanic Panic. Accusations that secret networks of devil worshippers were meeting in underground rituals, abusing children, conducting human sacrifices. The details were different, no flying on broomsticks obviously, but the structure was identical. A vast, organized conspiracy, secret meetings, sexual perversion, attacks on children, devil worship. And just like in the witch trials, many people confessed. Children and adults both giving detailed accounts of ritual abuse. Multiple people in different states describing similar ceremonies. Was it real? Extensive FBI investigations found no evidence of organized satanic networks. The confessions came from suggestive interviewing techniques, false memories, and cultural contamination. People remembering things they'd heard about from media coverage. The Sabbath myth had returned. Different era, different details, but the same fundamental structure. Because apparently societies under stress need to believe in hidden enemies, in conspiracies, in evil others gathering in secret to destroy everything good. We want to believe that evil is organized, that it has meetings and membership roles and a clear hierarchy. Because organized evil can theoretically be fought and defeated. The scarier truth that evil is often banal, diffuse, systemic, emerging from ordinary people, making ordinary choices that's harder to confront. So what do we do with the Sabbath myth? How do we make sense of it? I think we understand it as a window, a view into the fears, anxieties, and power structures of early modern Europe. The myth tells us that these societies feared women's independence, sexual autonomy, and knowledge. It tells us they feared social disorder, inverted hierarchies, loss of control. It tells us they needed scapegoats, enemies to blame, others to purge, and most importantly, it tells us that humans are capable of creating elaborate shared delusions and then treating those delusions as reality. We can torture people into confirming our fantasies. We can build legal systems around imaginary crimes. We can kill thousands based on stories that never happened. That's the real horror of the Sabbath myth. Not that people believed witches flew to forest gatherings, but that they believed it so thoroughly, so completely, that they built an entire infrastructure of persecution around it. But here's the question we haven't fully addressed yet: when did it stop? How did Europe finally wake up from this nightmare? What changed that made the witch trials finally end, because they did end? The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe happened in 1782 in Switzerland. That's still shockingly recent. The American Revolution had just ended, but it means the witch trials did stop. Something shifted. Skepticism grew. Legal standards changed. The mythology lost its power. So what were the turning points? What made communities finally reject the Sabbath myth and recognize that they'd been murdering innocent people? And perhaps more importantly, are those protections still in place? Or are we at risk of sliding back into that kind of mass hysteria? Those are the questions we need to explore, because understanding how the madness ended is just as important as understanding how it began. Let's look at the turning points, the voices of reason that finally grew loud enough to stop the killing. 1631, Bamberg, Germany. For 5 years, smoke from execution pyres had risen over the city almost continuously. Over 1,000 people burned. The witch-hunting Prince Bishop Johann Georg II, Fuchs von Dornheim, seemed unstoppable. His specially built torture prison was operating at full capacity. His witch commission was arresting people faster than they could be tried. And then on July the 16th, 1631, something remarkable happened. The Prince Bishop died, and almost overnight the trials stopped. The torture chambers fell silent. The pyres went cold. Within months, Swedish armies would occupy Bamberg and the entire infrastructure of witch hunting would be dismantled. But here's what I find fascinating. It wasn't a philosophical awakening that ended the Bamberg trials. It wasn't a sudden recognition that innocent people were being murdered. It was one man dying, one death ending 1,000 deaths. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If ending the witch trials was that simple, that dependent on individual decisions by people in power, why did it take so long? Why did the trials continue for 2 more centuries in some places? The answer is complicated, messy, and ultimately hopeful. Because slowly, incrementally, piece by piece, the foundations of witch hunting began to crack. Let me show you how. The first cracks appeared not from philosophical enlightenment, but from something more practical: exhaustion and overreach. Remember what we talked about earlier, how witch trials created a self-perpetuating cycle. Each tortured person had to name accomplices. Those people were arrested and tortured and named more people. Eventually, the circle of accusations grew too wide. Too many people were implicated. Too many powerful, well-connected people. In Würzburg in 1629, that chancellor's letter we quoted described city officials, doctors, clerics being accused. When the wealthy and powerful started getting caught in the net, suddenly, people in authority had personal stakes in questioning the system. It's grimly ironic, isn't it? When only poor women were accused, the trials continued. But when a wealthy merchant's wife got accused when a bishop's nephew was implicated, suddenly there was a problem that needed solving. This happened across Europe. Witch trials tended to burn themselves out when they started consuming the elite. When accusations moved from margins to centre, from powerless to powerful, and that's when appeals to higher authorities became effective. In Bamberg and Würzburg, when prominent citizens were accused, their families had resources to appeal to the imperial chamber court in Speyer, to the Holy Roman Emperor himself. These appeals cited legal irregularities, excessive torture, due process violations. And crucially, they worked. In 1630, the emperor issued a condemnation of the Würzburg persecutions, not because he was philosophically opposed to witch trials necessarily, but because the trials had become politically problematic. The lesson here is uncomfortable, but important justice often emerges not from moral awakening, but from self-interest of the powerful. But there were genuine voices of moral courage too, people who spoke up even when it was dangerous. We've mentioned Friedrich Spee before, but let's look more closely at his remarkable book, Cautio Criminalis, published in 1631, the same year Bamberg's Prince Bishop died. Spee was a Jesuit priest who'd served as a confessor to accused witches before their executions. He'd heard their final confessions, walked with them to the stake, and what he heard broke him. Women confessing to him privately that they were innocent, that they'd confessed under torture only to make it stop, that they'd named innocent neighbours because they had to name someone, that they were about to die for crimes they didn't commit. And Spee couldn't reveal what he'd heard in confession. The confessional seal was absolute. So he watched them burn, knowing the truth, unable to speak it. Eventually it destroyed him. He wrote Cautio Criminalis as an act of conscience, but he published it anonymously because he knew speaking out could make him a target. The book is remarkable. It's not a philosophical treatise against witch beliefs. Spee doesn't actually deny that witches exist. Instead, he systematically dismantles the judicial process. He argues that the use of torture makes trials fundamentally unjust, that innocent people will confess under sufficient pain, that the whole system is designed to produce false confessions. He writes with devastating clarity, "Torture has the power to make the innocent seem guilty." The book spread. It was cited in court cases. It influenced other clergy and legal scholars, and slowly it began to change minds. But here's what's heartbreaking. Spee paid a price for his courage. Though he published anonymously, his authorship became known. He was essentially exiled from mainstream positions. He died in 1635, just 4 years after publication, while tending to plague victims he'd volunteered for this dangerous work, perhaps because he felt he had nothing left to lose. He was 44 years old. The man who helped end witch trials didn't live to see their full demise, but his words outlived him. Around the same time, something else was shifting the scientific revolution. In the 1600s, people like Galileo, Newton, Descartes were developing new ways of understanding the world. Natural laws, mathematical principles, empirical observation, and this new worldview was fundamentally incompatible with witch trials. If the world operates according to natural laws, then how do supernatural interventions work? If effects require causes, then how does cursing someone from a distance cause them harm? If we can predict planetary motion with mathematics, then why can't we measure or predict magical effects? The scientific method demanded evidence, reproducibility, and witchcraft by definition produced neither. This didn't happen overnight. Many early scientists still believed in some forms of magic or supernatural intervention. Newton himself was fascinated by alchemy and biblical prophecy, but the general direction was clear toward a worldview where supernatural explanations were increasingly unnecessary, where thunder was atmospheric electricity, not witches' weather magic, where illness was natural disease, not magical cursing. In 1668, the Royal Society of London, one of the first scientific societies, was investigating a case of alleged demonic possession, and their conclusion after careful observation was essentially, this seems to be epilepsy, not demons. That might not sound revolutionary, but it was. It represented a fundamental shift from assuming supernatural causes to looking for natural ones, and once that shift happened in educated circles, witch trials began to seem primitive, backwards, superstitious. Nobody wanted to be seen as unenlightened. Legal reforms played a crucial role too. In France in 1682, King Louis XIV issued an edict that essentially ended witch trials in French territories, not because he denied witchcraft existed, but because he declared that cases of witchcraft should be treated as cases of poisoning or fraud, natural crimes requiring natural evidence. No more spectral evidence, no more testimony about invisible demons. If you claimed someone harmed you through witchcraft, you needed to prove actual poisoning or actual fraud, and suddenly almost no cases met the standard. The witch trials in France effectively ended with a stroke of the royal pen. Similarly, in 1736, Britain passed the Witchcraft Act, which repealed previous laws against witchcraft and instead made it illegal to accuse someone of having magical powers. The crime shifted from being a witch to falsely claiming to be a witch, or falsely accusing others. This was huge. It meant British law no longer recognised witchcraft as a real crime. These legal changes didn't come from philosophical enlightenment necessarily. They came from practical concerns. Witch trials were expensive, disruptive, and increasingly embarrassing to governments that wanted to seem modern and rational. And once major powers like France and Britain moved away from witch trials, other regions followed suit, not wanting to seem backwards by comparison. But even as the elite and educated were moving past witch trials, belief in witches persisted among ordinary people. And this is where things get interesting. Because what ended wasn't belief in witchcraft that continued for centuries, and in modified forms continues today. What ended was the judicial persecution of accused witches. The change wasn't people stopped believing in witches. The change was the legal system stopped killing people for it. That's an important distinction, because it means the victory wasn't total. It was institutional. The courts changed their standards even if popular belief lagged behind. In rural areas across Europe, people continued to believe in witches well into the 1800s, but they stopped bringing accusations to court because the courts wouldn't accept them. Instead, they might use social ostracism, refuse to do business with suspected witches, spread rumours. Harmful, yes, but not fatal. The legal infrastructure of persecution had been dismantled even if the underlying beliefs remained. And slowly, over generations, as education spread and scientific thinking became more common, even popular belief began to fade. Witches became folklore, fairy tales, symbols rather than literal threats. Now let's talk about one of the most remarkable turning points, confession and apology. We mentioned Salem's Day of Fasting and Repentance in 1697. But let me tell you more about what that actually looked like. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who'd condemned people to death, stood up in his church 5 years after the trials. His pastor read Sewall's written confession aloud while Sewall stood with his head bowed. In it, Sewall wrote, "Samuel Sewall desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God would pardon that sin." Think about that. A man who'd sent people to their deaths publicly admitting he was wrong, in front of his community, in front of God. It didn't bring the dead back, it didn't undo the trauma. But it was something, an acknowledgement, a crack in the edifice of certainty that had allowed the trials to happen. And then in 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., remember her, one of the primary accusers in Salem, one of the young women whose testimonies had condemned people, she made her own confession. She was 27 by then, no longer a child, and she stood in church and said, "I desire to lie in the dust and to be humbled for it, in that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity. I desire to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness of all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offence." She claimed she'd been deluded by Satan, that she hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Historians debate how sincere this was. Some think she was pressured by community shame. Others think she genuinely grappled with guilt for years. But regardless of motivation, these public confessions mattered. They established a narrative. What happened in Salem was wrong. Mistakes were made. Innocent people died. That narrative made future witch trials less likely, because it admitted the possibility of error. And once you admit that innocent people can be convicted, the entire system becomes suspect. Here's something that often surprises people. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe wasn't in some backwards rural area. It was in Switzerland in 1782. Switzerland. Not exactly a backwater. This was during the Enlightenment. Mozart was composing symphonies. The American Revolution had just ended, and Switzerland executed Anna Goldie for witchcraft. Her story is particularly tragic. Anna was a servant who was accused by her employer of bewitching his daughter after she rejected his sexual advances. She was tortured, confessed, and beheaded. Even at the time, there was immediate outcry. Intellectuals across Europe condemned it as barbaric. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with witch trials, and crucially, it was the last. After Anna Goldie, no European government conducted a legal execution for witchcraft. Why? Partly because the outcry was so strong. Partly because legal standards had changed everywhere else and Switzerland looked backwards by comparison. Partly because the Enlightenment had triumphed in elite culture, and witch trials were seen as embarrassing relics. In 2008, yes, 2008, just 17 years ago, the Swiss government officially exonerated Anna Goldie. A ceremony, a memorial, an acknowledgement that she'd been murdered by the state for a crime that didn't exist. 226 years late, but still an acknowledgement. So what can we learn from these turning points? First, that change is rarely dramatic. It's not like everyone woke up one day and said, "Oh, we've been murdering innocent people, let's stop." It was gradual, uneven, driven by multiple factors: political self-interest, scientific advancement, legal reform, moral courage, practical concerns. Second, that institutions matter more than beliefs. Witch trials ended not because everyone stopped believing in witches, but because legal systems stopped acting on those beliefs. Courts required evidence. Torture was banned. Spectral testimony was rejected. The beliefs could persist without the killing. Third, that voices of conscience do matter even when they're dangerous. People like Friedrich Spey, who risked their careers and lives to speak truth, they planted seeds. Their words outlived them and helped change the world. And fourth, and this is perhaps most important, that the change was fragile. Witch trials didn't end because human nature changed. They ended because specific legal and cultural safeguards were put in place, which means those safeguards can erode, those protections can be removed, and the patterns that led to witch trials, scapegoating, moral panic, conspiracy theories, persecution of vulnerable people, those patterns are still with us. Because here's what we haven't fully confronted yet. The witch trials weren't just about witches, they were about gender, about power, about who gets to have property, knowledge, independence and safety. 80% women. That's not random, that's a pattern, and patterns reveal structures. So we need to look directly at what the witch trials tell us about the treatment of women. Not just then, but the echoes that persist, because if we don't understand the gender politics of witch trials, we miss the most important lesson, and that's where we're going. Into the uncomfortable territory of recognizing that witch trials were at their core a form of gendered violence on a massive scale. Let's confront that truth together. Here's a statistic that should make us pause. Of the approximately 50,000 people executed for witchcraft in Europe between 1400 and 1782, roughly 40,000 were women, 80%. Now you might be thinking, you've mentioned that number several times already, and yes I have. But I'm bringing it up again because I want us to really sit with it, not as a passing fact, but as a pattern that demands explanation. If witch trials were really about finding people who made pacts with the devil, why were 4 out of 5 victims women? Did women have some special susceptibility to demonic influence? Were they more evil, more gullible, more likely to attend midnight Sabbaths? Or, and stay with me here, were witch trials fundamentally about something else entirely? What if they were never really about witchcraft at all? What if they were about controlling, punishing and eliminating women who didn't fit into very narrow, very restrictive categories? What if witch trials were at their core gendered violence dressed up in religious language? That's what we need to examine, not as a modern political interpretation imposed on history, but as a pattern the evidence itself reveals. Let's start with something the Malleus Maleficarum stated explicitly. Remember that phrase we quoted earlier, all witchcraft comes from carnal lust which is in women insatiable. This wasn't a fringe opinion. This was official doctrine printed in a book that was reprinted 30 times and cited in courts across Europe for 2 centuries. The text goes further. It argues that women are more credulous than men, more impressionable, more weak-willed, that they have weaker faith, weaker intellects, weaker moral resistance. There's a section where Heinrich Kramer etymologically breaks down the word femina woman and claims it comes from fee faith and minus, less. Therefore woman means less faith. This is of course completely wrong, terrible Latin. But it didn't matter. It was printed, it was cited, it was believed, and it provided theological justification for targeting women specifically. But here's what's interesting, the Malleus didn't invent misogyny. It just codified and systematized beliefs that already existed. Women were already seen as morally weaker, spiritually inferior, intellectually limited. The witch trials gave these beliefs teeth. They transformed cultural misogyny into legal persecution. Now let's look at who specifically was targeted, because not all women were equally vulnerable. We talked about this before, widows, healers, argumentative women. But let's dig deeper into what made these categories dangerous. A widow who inherited property was dangerous because she disrupted the male line of inheritance. In a patriarchal society, property is supposed to pass from father to son, husband to son, brother to brother, man to man. A widow in possession of land, a house, a business, she's an anomaly. She has economic power without a man controlling it. She can make decisions, conduct business, refuse to remarry. And here's where it gets dark if she's accused of witchcraft and convicted, her property is forfeited. And guess who often ends up with it? Male relatives. The dead husband's brothers or sons from a previous marriage. The accusers themselves sometimes. Let me give you a specific example. In Essex, England, a historian named Alan Macfarlane did a detailed study of witch accusations between 1560 and 1680. He found that in cases where he could trace property ownership, accused women were significantly more likely than average women to own property. And in cases where the accused was convicted and executed, that property was almost always transferred to male relatives or seized by authorities. Coincidence or motive? Then there's the issue of female knowledge and expertise. Think about midwives. In a world with no modern medicine, midwives were essential. They attended births, which in that era were dangerous. Maternal mortality was high, infant mortality higher still. When a birth went well, the midwife was praised. But when something went wrong, and something often went wrong, who got blamed? If a baby died, could it be natural causes in an era of poor nutrition and no antibiotics, or was it witchcraft? If a mother died in childbirth, was it medical complications, or had the midwife cursed her? Midwives lived with this constant vulnerability. Their expertise made them valuable, but also made them targets when outcomes were bad. And here's something particularly sinister. As university-trained male physicians began to emerge in the 1500s and 1600s, they wanted to take over childbirth. It was profitable. But midwives had generations of practical experience that male doctors lacked. Some historians argue, and this is debated, so I'm presenting it carefully, that witch accusations were sometimes used to eliminate female medical practitioners and clear the field for male doctors. Whether or not this was a deliberate conspiracy, the effect was real. Female healers were accused of witchcraft at higher rates than the general population, and as witch trials proceeded, the male medical establishment grew stronger. Coincidence maybe, but it's a pattern worth noticing. Let's talk about something that often gets glossed over: sexual accusation and reputation. Women's sexuality was, and in many places still is, subject to intense social policing. Women were supposed to be virgins until marriage, faithful wives during marriage, and chaste widows after. Any deviation could be dangerous. A woman who had a child outside marriage was vulnerable. The child itself might be accused of being demonic spawn. The woman might be accused of having congress with devils. A woman known for having multiple partners, or for rejecting advances, or even for being particularly beautiful. Any of these could make her suspicious. There's a case from Scotland in 1576 involving a woman named Bessie Dunlop. Part of the evidence against her included testimony about her appearance. Witnesses said she was unusually attractive, that men were drawn to her. This was presented as evidence of supernatural seduction. Clearly the devil was enhancing her beauty to lead men astray. She was executed. Being too beautiful was evidence of witchcraft. Being too ugly was also evidence, a sign that the devil had marked you. Women couldn't win. The standards were designed to be impossible to meet. Now let's address the 20%. The men who were accused. When you look at who these men were, the pattern continues to illuminate the gender politics at play. Many were relatives of accused women, husbands who defended their wives too vigorously, sons who stood up for their mothers, brothers who protected their sisters. In defending women accused of witchcraft, these men made themselves suspicious. They were going against the community consensus. They were prioritizing family loyalty over public safety. Clearly they might be witches too, or bewitched by the female witch. Other accused men were those who violated gender norms in some way. Men who worked in traditionally female occupations, healers, herbalists. Men who were perceived as too effeminate, too gentle, not masculine enough. Or men who were outsiders in some way, foreign, different ethnicity, different religion. In other words, the men accused were often those who either defended women or who themselves failed to perform masculinity correctly. The trials enforced gender norms for everyone, but women bore the overwhelming brunt. There's one regional exception that's worth examining: Iceland. In Iceland, about 60% of those executed for witchcraft were men. It's one of the only places where male accused outnumbered female accused. Why? Historians have debated this for years. Some argue it's because Icelandic accusations often centered on types of magic that were coded as masculine in Nordic culture, like rune magic, or storm raising for fishing advantage. Others point out that Icelandic society had somewhat different gender dynamics than continental Europe. Women had slightly more legal rights, could own property more easily. But here's what's interesting. Even in Iceland, when we look at the nature of accusations, gender still matters. Men were often accused of practicing learned magic, book magic, rune magic things, requiring literacy and education. Women were accused of more traditional folk magic, love spells, healing gone wrong. Even where the numbers differ, the gendered assumptions about types of magic persist. Let me share a particularly revealing case that brings all these threads together. In 1643 in Suffolk, England, there was a notorious witch-finder named Matthew Hopkins. He was responsible for more executions than any other single person in English history, about 300 people in just 2 years. Hopkins had a particular method. He'd go to a town, offer his services, and conduct investigations. He'd strip accused women naked, looking for the devil's mark. Any mole birthmark or blemish could qualify. He'd use sleep deprivation, walking women back and forth until they collapsed or confessed. And he'd use the swimming test. But here's what's revealing. Hopkins wrote a pamphlet defending his methods, and in it he addresses the question of why so many accused were women. His answer: Women were naturally more prone to sin, more easily corrupted, more vengeful and malicious. He cites the Bible church fathers and the Malleus Maleficarum. He wasn't embarrassed by the gender disparity. He thought it proved his methods were working, of course. Most witches were women because women were the problem. Matthew Hopkins eventually fell from favour. His methods became too controversial, even for 1640s England. But his writings survive, and they're a window into how witch hunters thought about gender. Women weren't just incidental victims, they were the intended targets. Now some of you might be thinking, but surely not everyone believed this. Surely some people recognised it was unjust. And you're right, some did. We mentioned Reginald Scott's book, The Discovery of Witchcraft, from 1584. In it, he doesn't just debunk witch beliefs, he specifically calls out the gender bias. He writes that most accusations target old women who are poor, sullen, superstitious and papists, or who are simply melancholy. He argues that these women are being scapegoated for society's problems. He was right, of course. But his book was burned by order of King James III, who was himself obsessed with witches, and wrote his own treatise on demonology. Being right doesn't always matter when power decides otherwise. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for us sitting here in 2025. It's easy to think of witch trials as something safely in the past, something that happened to other people in other times, a relic of a less enlightened age, but the patterns persist. Violence against women didn't end with witch trials. Femicide, the killing of women because they're women, continues globally. According to UN statistics, a woman is killed by a partner or family member every 11 minutes somewhere in the world. The specific language has changed. We don't call it witchcraft anymore. But women are still killed for stepping outside prescribed roles, for having independence, for rejecting male authority, for owning things, knowing things, saying things that make them inconvenient. In some parts of the world, witch accusations still happen. In Papua New Guinea, hundreds of women are accused and killed each year. In parts of Africa, elderly women are driven out of communities or murdered on suspicion of witchcraft. And even in places without literal witch accusations, women face violence for the same underlying reasons: being in the wrong place, having the wrong amount of power, threatening someone's control or inheritance or ego. The witch trials teach us that gendered violence doesn't need to be individual or random. It can be systematic, cultural, encoded in law and religion and social practice. And that when a society decides certain people, certain women are acceptable targets, the violence that follows can be horrifying in its scale. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we recognize that the witch trials were never gender neutral. They were an expression of patriarchal power at its most lethal. Second, we understand that the vulnerability of those women wasn't random. They were targeted for specific reasons: property knowledge, independence, sexuality, age, refusal to conform. Third, we acknowledge that while legal witch trials ended, the underlying patterns haven't disappeared. They've adapted. They've found new expressions. And fourth, and this is crucial, we recognize that calling out these patterns isn't politicizing history. The politics were always there. We're just finally being honest about them. The witch trials show us what happens when misogyny becomes institutionalized, when cultural beliefs about female inferiority become legal doctrine, when violence against women becomes normalized, systematized, and blessed by authority. That's the lesson. That's what we need to carry forward. But here's what we haven't addressed yet, and it's perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. How much of what we think we know about witch trials is actually accurate? Because here's the thing we've been talking about: witches flying on broomsticks, attending Sabbaths, making pacts with the devil. We've mentioned these details as historical facts, things people believed, things people confessed to. But how much of that imagery is actually historical, and how much of it is later invention, Hollywood mythology, Halloween decoration that we've projected backward onto history? Do we actually know what historical witch trials looked like? Or have we been fooled by popular culture into accepting a simplified, sanitized, even romanticized version of events? Because if we're going to learn from history, we need to know what really happened. Not the costume shop version, not the theme park version, the real documented, often much stranger and much darker version. So let's do something necessary. Let's debunk the myths. Let's separate the real history of witch trials from the fiction that's accumulated around them. Because the truth, as always, is more complex and more revealing than the myths. Quick question. When I say witch trial, what's the first image that pops into your head? I'm willing to bet it's something like this. A woman in black, maybe with a pointy hat tied to a wooden stake, flames rising around her, a crowd watching, probably somewhere vaguely medieval with cobblestone streets and thatched cottages. Maybe you're picturing Salem, except instead of New England, you're imagining some European village. And instead of hanging, you're seeing burning. If that's what you pictured, congratulations. You've been lied to by every Halloween decoration, every history textbook illustration, and about 90% of movies and TV shows. Because here's the truth. Almost none of that imagery is historically accurate. And I don't mean it's slightly off. I mean we have the wrong method of execution, the wrong time period, the wrong aesthetic, sometimes even the wrong continent. So let's do something that might be a little uncomfortable. Let's take everything you think you know about witch trials and examine whether it's actually true. Because if we're going to learn from history, we need to know what actually happened, not the Hollywood version. Ready? Let's bust some myths. Here's what everyone knows. The Salem witches were burned at the stake right wrong. Completely wrong. In colonial America, including Salem, the method of execution for witchcraft was hanging. Always hanging. 19 people hanged in Salem in 1692. Not one was burned. In fact, I can't find a single documented case of anyone being burned for witchcraft anywhere in colonial America or the later United States. So where does the burning image come from Europe? In continental Europe, Germany, France, Scotland, parts of Italy and Spain, burning was indeed the method. It was considered appropriate for heresy, and witchcraft was classified as heretical. But England used hanging for witchcraft following their general criminal law, and since the American colonies followed English legal traditions, they used hanging too. The one exception to hanging in Salem was Giles Corey, who was pressed to death with stones. But that wasn't an execution for witchcraft, it was torture to force him to enter a plea so he could be tried. So every movie, every TV show, every Halloween haunted house that shows Salem witches burning at the stake historically wrong. It never happened. Why does this matter? Because the method of execution tells us something about legal traditions and how different societies classified witchcraft. Conflating American and European practices obscures important differences. Also, it just bugs me when people get basic facts wrong and then call it history. Okay, but in Europe they were burned alive, right? Just straight up lit on fire while conscious. Well, sometimes. But not always, and not even usually in many places. In many regions, convicted witches were strangled or beheaded. First, then their bodies were burned. This was considered merciful. The burning was symbolic, purifying the community, making sure the witch couldn't rise again, but the actual death came from strangling or beheading. Being burned alive was reserved for the most severe cases, witches who refused to repent, those convicted of particularly heinous crimes, repeat offenders. So while it definitely happened, and yes, it's as horrible as it sounds, it wasn't the universal method, even where burning was used. Why does this distinction matter? Because it reveals that even in their brutality, these executions had gradations. There were merciful executions and severe ones. The authorities weren't just mindlessly burning people, they had entire frameworks for calibrating suffering. Which is somehow more disturbing than mindless cruelty. It's organised cruelty. Bureaucratic cruelty. When you think witch trials, you probably think medieval, right, the Dark Ages, knights and castles and plague doctors. Nope. Wrong era entirely. The peak of witch trials was the early modern period, roughly 1560 to 1630. That's Renaissance and Reformation era. This is when Shakespeare was writing plays, when Galileo was doing astronomy, when the printing press had been around for over a century. The actual medieval period, say 900 to 1400, had relatively few witch trials. The medieval Catholic Church actually discouraged witch hunting. There was this text called the Canon Episcopi from around 900 AD that essentially said belief in witches flying and supernatural powers was superstition and illusion, not reality. So during the actual Middle Ages, the official church position was that witches weren't real in the way people imagined them. It wasn't until the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and culture supposedly, that witch hunting really took off. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1486, right at the cusp of the Renaissance. And the absolute worst periods, Würzburg, Bamberg, the peak of German trials, those were in the 1620s, the 30 Years' War era, well into what we'd call the early modern period. Even Salem was 1692. That's closer to the American Revolution than to the medieval period. So when people say medieval witch hunt as shorthand for backwards thinking, they're not just being imprecise, they're defaming the wrong era. The Renaissance and Reformation periods killed way more alleged witches than the Middle Ages ever did. You've probably heard statistics like 9 million women were killed in the witch trials, or millions of witches were burned. These numbers circulate constantly, especially online and in some feminist literature, but they're wrong, very wrong. The best historical scholarship based on actual court records and execution logs estimates 40,000 to 60,000 executions across all of Europe and colonial America over about 400 years. Now, is that still horrific? Absolutely. That's 40,000 to 60,000 innocent people murdered by the state. It's a tragedy of immense proportions, but it's not millions, not even close. So where do the inflated numbers come from? Partly from 19th century writers who exaggerated for effect. Partly from sloppy citations, someone makes an estimate, someone else cites it without checking, and suddenly it becomes fact. And partly, I think, from a desire to make the trials seem worse than they were, to emphasize how terrible patriarchal violence has been. But here's the thing, we don't need to exaggerate. The real numbers are bad enough, and exaggerating actually undermines our credibility. If we're claiming millions died when the actual number is tens of thousands, we look like we don't care about accuracy. The truth is sufficient. We don't need to inflate it. This is a myth from the other direction, not from Halloween pop culture, but from modern Wicca and neo-pagan movements. The idea goes like this: the witch trials targeted surviving practitioners of pre-Christian pagan religions. The witches who were killed were actually continuing ancient goddess worship and nature religions. And the trials were a Christian campaign to stamp out this surviving paganism. This narrative was popularised by a British anthropologist named Margaret Murray in the 1920s. She wrote books arguing that there was an organised witch cult throughout Europe, a survival of pre-Christian religion, and that the people executed in witch trials were members of this cult. It's a compelling story, and it gave birth to modern Wicca Gerald Gardner, who founded Wicca in the 1950s, based much of his new religion on Murray's theories. The only problem, Murray was wrong. Completely, thoroughly wrong. There's no evidence of any organised pagan survival, none, no witch cult, no secret goddess worship networks. The people executed in witch trials were overwhelmingly Christians, Protestants and Catholics, who went to church, baptised their children, took communion. They weren't practising an alternative religion. They were accused of crimes they didn't commit within the dominant religious framework. Now were there remnants of folk practices with pre-Christian origins? Absolutely. Healing traditions, seasonal celebrations, folklore, these existed. But they weren't organised paganism, and the people who practiced them didn't think of themselves as witches or pagans. They thought of themselves as Christians, who also knew some useful folk remedies. The trials weren't about stamping out paganism, they were about scapegoating vulnerable Christians. Modern Wicca is a beautiful, meaningful religion for many people, but it's not a survival of ancient witchcraft. It's a 20th century creation inspired by romanticised ideas about what ancient witchcraft might have been, and the people killed in witch trials. They're not the martyrs of neo-pagan faith. They're victims of Christian-on-Christian violence. Honouring them means telling their true stories, not projecting modern religious identities onto them. This is subtle but important. Even scholarly work sometimes frames witch trials as about magic or about supernatural beliefs. But here's what we've seen throughout this journey: the trials were rarely about magic itself. They were about property disputes, personal vendettas, social control, economic anxiety, misogyny and scapegoating. Magic was the language used to prosecute these conflicts, the excuse, the justification. If you wanted to steal your neighbour's land, accuse her of witchcraft. If you wanted to eliminate a business competitor, witchcraft. If a woman rejected your advances or embarrassed you publicly, witchcraft. The supernatural element wasn't the cause, it was the weapon. This matters, because if we think the trials were about genuine belief in magic, we might conclude, well, people back then were just superstitious. We're more rational now. It couldn't happen today. But if we understand the trials were about using accusations as weapons in social conflict, then we realise, oh, that absolutely could happen today. That does happen today. The specific accusations change. We don't call it witchcraft anymore, but the mechanism remains. Here's a comforting myth, educated people. Intellectuals, the elite, they knew better. It was only ignorant, backwards peasants who believed in witchcraft. Except no, not even slightly true. The Malleus Maleficarum was written by a learned Dominican friar with university education. King James I of England wrote a book on demonology. He was literally a king educated in classical languages and theology. The judges conducting trials were often university-trained lawyers. Many of the most enthusiastic witch hunters were the educated elite. Meanwhile, there are documented cases of peasants expressing skepticism. Ordinary people questioning whether their neighbour could really fly or turn into a hare. The myth that education protects you from participating in mass hysteria is comforting but false. Intelligence, education, social status, none of these make you immune to ideological capture. If anything, educated people are often better at rationalising their participation in atrocities. They can construct elaborate theological or legal justifications for what they're doing. The lesson isn't education prevents evil. The lesson is evil is perfectly compatible with intelligence and learning, which is scarier but more accurate. When we think of the Salem witch trials, we imagine this extended period of terror, right? Years of accusations, trials, executions. But Salem lasted 10 months. February 1692 to May 1693. Less than a year. That's not to minimise the horror. 19 executions in 10 months is horrifying. But it wasn't this drawn-out years-long persecution. In fact, most witch trial outbreaks were relatively short. A panic would flare up, burn intensely for a few months, or a couple years, then collapse when it overreached or exhausted itself. The long duration we think of, 1400 to 1782, nearly 4 centuries, that's the span of trials across all of Europe and America combined. No single community endured continuous witch trials for centuries. Why does this matter? Because the burst and collapse pattern tells us something about how moral panics work. They build quickly, feed on themselves, escalate rapidly, and then suddenly people wake up and realize how insane things have gotten. Understanding this pattern might help us recognize and interrupt it when we see it happening in our own time. You may have heard this one: the Salem accusers were experiencing hallucinations and convulsions because they ate rye bread contaminated with ergot, a fungus that produces compounds similar to LSD. This theory was proposed in a 1976 article in Science magazine, and it's been repeated ever since. It sounds scientific, neat, a rational explanation. But historians and scholars of Salem have largely rejected it. Why, first, ergot poisoning has specific symptoms: gangrene, loss of limbs, death. These weren't present in Salem. Second, the pattern of accusations doesn't match ergot exposure. The accusers were from different households eating different food sources, but their accusations followed social and political patterns targeting people on the opposite side of village disputes. Third, ergot theory doesn't explain the adults who participated. The judges, the ministers, the community members who supported the trials, were they all hallucinating too? The ergot theory is appealing because it medicalizes the crisis. It makes it about biology, not human choice. It lets everyone off the hook. But Salem wasn't about poisoned bread. It was about community conflict, factional disputes, and people making conscious choices to accuse, judge, and execute their neighbours. That's less comfortable than it was just a fungus, but it's more accurate and more important. Okay, this one is more complex. Because yes, people confessed to flying on broomsticks. It's in the trial records. But did they actually fly? Obviously not. So where does the broomstick image come from? We talked earlier about possible hallucinogenic ointments. That's one theory. Another theory involves artistic representations. Medieval and Renaissance art sometimes showed witches with brooms as a symbol of domestic duties. Brooms represented women's work. The flying was added later, combining the domestic symbol with the Sabbath flight narrative. By the time we get to 19th century illustrations, and then 20th century Halloween imagery, the flying broomstick has become iconic. It's witchcraft's visual shorthand. But historically, most trial records describe flying on animals: goats, pigs, wolves, or on demons who carry them, or simply flying through supernatural power with no vehicle at all. The broomstick is more pop culture than historical reality. It's become the symbol because it's visually distinctive and easy to draw, which is fine for Halloween decorations. But when we're studying actual history, we need to be clear about what's real and what's later invention. So here's what we're left with after all this myth-busting. The real witch trials were more recent than we thought, more legally complex than we imagined, more educated people involved than we'd like to admit, and more about human choices than about superstition or fungus or ancient paganism. They happened during what we call the early modern period, when printing presses and universities and enlightened thought coexisted with mass execution of innocent people. The victims weren't members of some secret religion. They were ordinary Christians whose neighbours for various reasons wanted them dead or neutralised. And the whole thing was enabled by legal systems that accepted unprovable accusations and used torture to extract confessions. That's the reality. Less aesthetically clean than the Halloween version. More complicated, more human, and therefore more relevant. Because if we understand what really happened, not the mythologized version, we can recognize the patterns when they start to emerge in our own time. And they are emerging. The question is, can we recognize them? Can we interrupt the cycle before it escalates? That's what we need to talk about finally. The hardest part. The part that brings all of this history crashing into our present moment. What do the witch trials teach us about right now? About our politics, our social media, our current moment of polarization and accusation? Can history actually protect us from repeating these patterns? Or are we doomed to keep making the same mistakes with different vocabulary? Let's confront that question. Because after everything we've learned, we need to ask, what do we do with this knowledge? How does understanding the witch trials change how we live right now? That's where we end this journey. By making it matter. So here we are, nearly 2 hours into this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. And if you're still with me, and I genuinely hope you are, you might be thinking, okay, that was fascinating. Horrifying, but fascinating. But why does it matter now? Why spend all this time on something that ended over 200 years ago? Fair question. And here's my answer. The witch trials aren't over. Not literally, of course. We're not burning people at the stake in Massachusetts. But the patterns that enabled the witch trials, the psychological mechanisms, the social dynamics, those are still with us, alive and well and adapting to modern technology. And if we don't recognize them, if we don't learn from what happened between 1400 and 1782, we're at risk of repeating it. Maybe not with the same language, maybe not with the same methods, but with the same devastating results. Let me show you what I mean. First, let's acknowledge something uncomfortable. Witch hunts in the literal sense still happen right now. In 2025, in Papua New Guinea, hundreds of people, mostly women, are accused of witchcraft and killed every year, burned alive, tortured, driven from their communities. The government has tried to intervene, but the practice continues, especially in rural areas. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, tens of thousands of people, primarily elderly women, live in witch camps, refugee settlements for those who've been accused of witchcraft and driven from their homes. In Ghana alone, there are multiple camps housing thousands of accused witches. In India, according to the National Crime Records Bureau, over 2,000 people were killed for witchcraft-related reasons between 2000 and 2016. That's just the documented cases. Saudi Arabia still prosecutes people for sorcery under Islamic law. In 2011, a woman was beheaded for witchcraft and sorcery. So when I say witch hunts aren't over, I mean it literally. In multiple countries, people are still being accused, persecuted, and killed for crimes that don't exist. And the victims, overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly elderly, overwhelmingly poor. The same demographics as the European witch trials. The pattern persists because the underlying causes persist. Poverty, lack of education, communities under stress, looking for scapegoats, misogyny encoded in culture and law. But let's bring it closer to home, to places where we don't have literal witch accusations. Because here's what I've realized while researching this: we don't need the word witch to have witch hunts. We just need the mechanism. Let me explain. A witch hunt at its core is about identifying an internal enemy, a hidden threat within the community, defining that enemy through impossible to disprove accusations, using fear to bypass normal standards of evidence and due process, encouraging accusations that spread in networks, creating cascading paranoia, punishing not just the accused but those who defend them, continuing until the panic either exhausts itself or consumes the accusers. Sound familiar? Because if you've been paying attention to politics, social media, or cultural conflicts over the past decade, you've seen this pattern play out. Multiple times, in multiple directions. Let's talk about the most obvious example, McCarthyism. In the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy led investigations into alleged communist infiltration of the US government. Thousands of people were accused of being communists or communist sympathizers. Careers were destroyed. Lives were ruined. The accusations spread through networks. One accused person would name others under pressure. Those people would name more, and on it went. Evidence standards collapsed. Being named by someone else was treated as evidence. Having attended certain meetings, known certain people, belonged to certain organizations, all became suspicious. And defending someone accused of communism, that made you suspect too. The accusation was contagious. Eventually the panic collapsed, partly because McCarthy overreached and accused people too prominent and well-connected, and partly because journalists and politicians finally pushed back. Does this sound familiar? It should. It's the exact same pattern as the witch trials. So much so that Arthur Miller wrote his famous play The Crucible in 1953 using the Salem witch trials as an allegory for McCarthyism. The parallels were obvious to everyone. But here's what's interesting: McCarthy wasn't the only one creating this dynamic. Both sides of the Cold War had their own witch hunts. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, people were accused of being enemies of the people, bourgeois infiltrators, counter-revolutionaries, show trials, forced confessions, networks of accusation. The ideology was opposite capitalism versus communism, but the mechanism was identical. Which tells us something important: witch hunts aren't about specific ideologies. They're about mechanisms of social control that any ideology can weaponize. Fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, the Satanic Panic. Across the United States and parts of Europe, there was a wave of accusations involving satanic ritual abuse. Daycare centers were supposedly fronts for devil-worshipping cults that molested children in ritualistic ceremonies. Accusations spread. Trials were held. The McMartin preschool case in California lasted 7 years and cost $15 million. No physical evidence was ever found. The accusations came from children who'd been subjected to leading suggestive interview techniques. Other cases followed the same pattern. Therapists using questionable techniques helped adult patients recover supposedly repressed memories of satanic abuse. These patients then accused family members who were sometimes prosecuted. Eventually the panic collapsed. FBI investigations found no evidence of organized satanic networks. Psychologists demonstrated how false memories could be created through suggestive questioning. Convictions were overturned, but lives had been destroyed. People spent years in prison for crimes that never happened. Families were torn apart. And here's the eerie part: the structure of the accusations, secret organizations, ritualistic meetings, harming children, conspiracy to destroy society. It's almost identical to the witches' Sabbath mythology. Different details, same architecture. A modern witch hunt in everything but name. Now let's talk about something more current and more controversial: social media pylons and cancel culture. And before anyone gets defensive, I'm not making a partisan point here. This happens across the political spectrum. Here's the pattern. Someone is accused of wrongthink racism, sexism, transphobia, fascism, being a social justice warrior, being woke. The specific accusation varies depending on who's doing the accusing. The accusation spreads rapidly on social media. Thousands of people, many of whom have no direct knowledge of the situation, weigh in. They amplify comment, add their own interpretations. The accused's entire history is excavated. Old tweets, old photos, old associations, everything is examined for additional evidence of guilt. Context is often stripped away. Ambiguity is resolved in favor of guilt. Defending the accused becomes risky. Why are you defending a racist, sexist, fascist? Silence is also suspicious. Silence is violence, or, if you're not speaking out, you're complicit. The accused may apologize, but apologies are often rejected as insufficient or insincere. Or they may refuse to apologize, which is taken as proof of guilt. Eventually there are consequences: job loss, public shaming, social exile, sometimes deserved, sometimes wildly disproportionate, sometimes based on misunderstandings or outright false accusations. Now, I want to be very clear, I'm not saying all accusations are false. I'm not saying there aren't real issues of racism, sexism, abuse and harm that need to be addressed. I'm not arguing for protecting powerful people from accountability. But I am saying the mechanism, rapid accusation network, spread evidence standards, collapsing punishment, without due process, contagion of suspicion. This mechanism is the same one that powered witch trials. And that should concern us. Because witch trials didn't kill guilty witches. They killed innocent people. The mechanism itself is the problem. Here's what witch trials teach us about recognizing these patterns. First, crisis breeds scapegoating. Witch trials peaked during times of stress, wars, plagues, climate disasters, religious conflict. When communities are under pressure, when resources are scarce, when the future is uncertain, people look for someone to blame. Look around. Climate change, economic inequality, pandemic aftermath, political polarization. We're living in a time of multiple overlapping crises, which means we're primed for scapegoating. We need to be vigilant about who gets blamed and whether the accusations make sense or are just convenient. Second, unfalsifiable accusations are dangerous. In witch trials, you couldn't prove you weren't a witch. How do you prove you didn't send your invisible spirit to harm someone? How do you prove you weren't at a Sabbath that left no physical evidence? Watch out for accusations that can't be disproven. You're secretly racist. You're a closet fascist. You're pretending to support X, but you really support Y. If an accusation is structured so that denial is treated as further evidence of guilt, that's a witch trial mechanism. Third networks of accusations spread like disease. Witch trials created cascades. One person accused 5 others, those 5 accused 25 more, and suddenly hundreds were implicated. Social media does this on steroids. One tweet can become thousands of retweets. One accusation can spread to millions in hours. We need to be cautious about participating in these cascades. Ask yourself, do I actually know this is true, or am I just amplifying someone else's accusation? Fourth, defending the accused becomes dangerous. In witch trials, defending someone accused of witchcraft made you suspicious. You might be a witch yourself. You might be under a spell. When we create cultures where defending someone accused, even saying, wait, let's get all the facts, makes you a target too. That's a witch hunt mechanism. Healthy systems allow for defense. They allow for questioning. They allow for doubt. When those become dangerous, we're in trouble. Fifth, the righteous are often the most dangerous. The witch trials weren't conducted by people who thought they were evil. They were conducted by people who thought they were righteous, protecting their communities, fighting evil, serving God. The road to atrocity is paved with moral certainty. When you're absolutely sure you're right, when you're absolutely sure your enemies are evil, when you're absolutely sure the ends justify the means, that's when you're most likely to become an inquisitor. Humility, uncertainty, willingness to be wrong, these aren't weaknesses, they're safeguards. So what do we do with all this? How do we honour the victims of witch trials? How do we ensure it doesn't happen again? Here are some thoughts. First, demand due process. Formal legal systems or informal social ones, either way. Accusations should require evidence. Real evidence, not just other accusations. And the accused should have opportunity to respond to defend themselves to present context. This protects everyone, because anyone can be accused. Anyone can become inconvenient to someone else. Second, be skeptical of moral panics. When everyone is talking about the same threat, when accusations are spreading rapidly, when fear is escalating, pause. Ask questions. Look for evidence. Consider alternative explanations. Most real problems don't require panic to address them. Manufactured crises do. Third, protect the vulnerable. Witch trials targeted people who couldn't defend themselves. The poor, the elderly, women without male protection, outsiders. Who are the vulnerable in our communities now? Who lacks institutional protection? Who gets blamed first when things go wrong? Pay attention to patterns. Who gets accused most often? Who faces the harshest consequences? Whose accusations are taken most seriously? And whose are dismissed fourth? Preserve the ability to dissent. Healthy societies allow for disagreement, for questioning, for saying, wait, I'm not sure about this. When dissent becomes dangerous, when asking questions gets you labelled as an enemy, when you have to pretend to believe things you don't believe to stay safe, that's the environment where witch trials flourish. Protect dissent, especially when it's uncomfortable. Fifth, remember history. The witch trials happened. Real people died. Their names, most of them, are lost. Their stories mostly are forgotten. But we can remember the pattern. We can teach it. We can recognize it when it starts to emerge. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And if we know the rhyme scheme, we can interrupt it. Let me tell you one more story before we end. In 1697, 5 years after the Salem trials, Samuel Sewall stood in church and publicly confessed his error. He asked for forgiveness for the role he played in condemning innocent people to death. It took him 5 years. 5 years to recognize what he'd done, 5 years to find the courage to say it publicly, but he did it. He stood up, he said, "I was wrong, I am sorry." And that moment, that act of acknowledgement, that's what eventually allowed Salem to begin healing. Not immediately, not completely, but it began the process. Because the opposite of witch hunting isn't perfect moral clarity. It's the willingness to admit error, to change course, to say, we got this wrong. That's the hope. That's how the pattern breaks. Not by being right all the time, but by being humble enough to admit when we're wrong, brave enough to speak up when we see injustice, wise enough to recognize the patterns that lead to atrocity. We've been on a long journey tonight, from autumn leaves and harvest festivals through torture chambers and execution grounds to modern social media and contemporary politics. From the forests of Germany, where thousands burned, to the courtrooms of Salem, where 19 hang, to the present moment where the patterns persist in new forms. What connects all of it is this humans under stress looking for certainty in an uncertain world, finding scapegoats instead of solutions. But also humans capable of recognizing patterns, learning from history, choosing differently. The witch trials show us what we're capable of at our worst. But the people who spoke up, Friedrich Spee, Reginald Scott the judge, who finally said, "Enough," they show us what we're capable of at our best. We're the inheritors of both traditions, the inquisitors and the resistors, the accusers and the defenders. Which tradition we continue is up to us. If you've stayed with me this whole time through nearly 2 hours of history, horror and hard truths, thank you. Genuinely thank you. These stories need to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered. These patterns need to be recognized. And if even one person watching this recognizes a witch hunt mechanism starting in their own community, their own online space, their own political movement, and interrupts it, then this was worth it. History doesn't have to repeat. But only if we remember, only if we learn, only if we choose differently. The witches of autumn are gone, but their lesson remains: fear is the real monster. Scapegoating is the real crime, and the only protection is vigilance, humility, and the courage to say, wait, this isn't right. Even when everyone around you is caught up in the hysteria, that's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what we owe to the 40,000 to 60,000 people who died for crimes that didn't exist. Remember them, learn from them, do better. Do! And hey, if you found this valuable, if it made you think, if it taught you something, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what surprised you most. Tell me if you've seen these patterns in your own experience. I read all the comments. I learn from you as much as I hope you learn from me. And if you want more stories like this, history that matters, stories that connect past to present lessons that might actually help us build a better future, stick around. Subscribe if you haven't. There are more stories to tell. Because history isn't just about what happened then. It's about understanding what's happening now, and maybe changing what happens next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about history, about truth, about learning from the past. Sweet dreams. And remember, the real magic isn't in spells or potions. It's in our ability to recognize patterns, resist manipulation, and choose compassion over fear. Until next time.